Top of the morning to you, IB family. How are we doing today? Welcome to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I am Vince D'Addario. That is Brian Driscoll. And we are going to have some fun today. During our little pre-show mixer, we thought about taking this show a complete opposite direction. We decided that's probably not a great idea. So we're going to stick with what our expectations are for Notre Dame season and where we think things are going to go and where other people think Notre Dame season is going to go. And that required a little bit of research on my part prior to the show. So we kind of went into the Wayback Machine a little bit and looked at where people thought that Notre Dame should be prior to each season. And then, of course, where they ended up. And you're going to see a trend, frankly,
right.
And a trend that has made me money in the past, which is always nice. So it's very interesting, and it's very real as well with the pessimism that is starting to surround Notre Dame football. And I told Brian before the show, we need to trademark BKPTSD because it is a real thing, people. It is a real thing, and I will tell you that I have it. And I try to ignore it, but it creeps up on you, man. And it is a real thing. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too today, Brian. And this is going to be a fun show. And this is going to kind of kick off our let's get back to this year's team talk, I guess is the best way to put it. And I mean, we're creeping up on, not creeping up. We're in July. Next month around this time, they're going to be in fall camp, most likely. And so we got to start talking about this 22 team. Not that recruiting isn't exciting, because it is. It is super exciting, but there is the present team.
Season kicks off in less than 2 months. Yeah. I mean, we're sitting here July 6th. The season starts September 3rd. I mean, that's less than 2 months away.
Exactly.
And recruiting has kept us incredibly busy, and we're thankful for that. But,
No doubt.
We've been itching to get back to this. And when we talk about expectations, we're not talking big picture. We're not talking about what the standard should be at Notre Dame, right? Because we've always said that the goal should always be a championship, right? That's always the objective. Now, that doesn't always mean that's a successful season, but that's the ultimate standard, right?
Absolutely.
And so, to me, when I look at it, Vince, it's what should we be expecting of this football team?
Yes.
Is this team capable of meeting that standard? And we kind of go through this every year, right, Vince? I mean, last year we were convincing people why it was absurd that the over-under for Notre Dame was 8.5. And we'd have people coming into this chat, and they would just come up with every reason in the world for why this was going to be the year that Notre Dame takes a step back. And last year was, well, look at all the players they lost, and they ranked in like the 120s in regards to production returning, according to Bill Connolly, who I dislike his formula for, his whole ranking. It's not really a ranking, but, his S&P, SP plus or whatever it is. But one thing he does that is valuable, because everybody can bring some value in some regards just about,
right,
is he does a formula of returning production.
Right.
And last year, Notre Dame was in the 120s. I think they're in the bottom 5.
Out of 130, right?
Yeah. And then this year they rank in the 60s. So there's clearly a lot of production coming back. And there's a lot of talent coming back. And from a team that really, honestly, didn't play that well last year, Vince, and still went 11-2.
Right.
And so, you look at it, and there's a lot of reasons to have some understandable skepticism about this football team. I think there's even more reasons to be kind of excited about this football team. And so we're going to dive into those. And that's what the purpose of the show is, Vince, because what I have felt for years is that there was this shift that happened kind of little past the halfway point of Brian Kelly's tenure. And coming into Kelly's tenure, obviously Notre Dame had been down for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, they finished the season in 2010 on a really strong note. They were 4-5 at one point in time, and finished the year with 4 straight wins, beat USC for the first time in 8 years, spanked Miami to bowl game.
Right.
Had a lot of players coming back, and there was, pretty high expectations for Notre Dame that yet next year. They start the season ranked 16th in the AP poll, and of course they disappointed. Well, then the next year they start the season unranked. And lo and behold, Notre Dame goes and plays for a championship that season and has good wins. And then kind of the expectations are back again. And, hey, where's Notre Dame going to be? And they, rank 14th in the preseason in the coaches poll, the AP poll 11th in the coaches poll, and they disappointed again. And it was just kind of like that was kind of the theme. They finished 20th and 24th that year, went 9-4. You know, your great season-ending victory was a pinstripe bowl win over Rutgers. And it
Yes.
just kind of continued on and on and on and on. And, 2014, you start 17th in both polls because, again, you finish 20th and 24th. And then they rise all the way into the top 5 and then plummet and finish outside of the top 25. Same thing kind of happened the next year. Expectations are high or not as high because of the struggles. And then Notre Dame overachieves a little bit on those expectations. Actually, that was the one year they were right at it. They finished 11th. And then they finished 11th, due mainly to losing their last 2 games. So after that, it was kind of like, okay, what is this team at? And then it was odd. It's kind of like, that was kind of the preseason rankings in 2016. They're a preseason top 10 team, and they go 4-8.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the shift at that point in time kind of turned into, okay, everybody thinking that this is going to be the year that Notre Dame turns it around, and they just never did. And then you started seeing, start paying more attention to the Vegas odds, Vince. And this is this is the intel that Vince brought up because we wanted to find out, what was the over under on their wins. Because I remember last year was 8.5, and didn't it start lower than that?
It was, I think it started like 8,
7.5.
7.5. Either way, it was a joke. Like I don't bet that much, to be honest with you, especially long-term, like future bets, which is what that is called. It's a futures bet. That is not something that I normally do because then your money's in limbo forever and you got to wait and all that. And when I say money, I'm like talking like $10. Like let me be real clear on that.
Throwing a couple mortgage payments on to Notre Dame winning their year.
I think I bet the most money I've ever bet on that over and under, though, at 8.5, because I was shocked that that's what it was. I think I put a 20 spot on it, right? And I'm like, that's the most money I ever spend at one time.
Which, if y'all know Vince, right? Like,
that's So, but 8.5 just seemed ridiculous to me. But then I started looking back, per Brian's assignment today. I started looking back over the last few years, all the way back to 2017. And it's kind of the same thing every year.
So here's what Vince came up with. In 2017, the over-under preseason was 7.5. Understandable. They were coming off a 4-8 season. They won 10. Then, because does it include postseason, Vince?
It does not. Regular season only. Yeah, at least that's what. At least recently, for sure.
So they won 9. Yeah. So we'll go there. They won 9. The next year, the over/under is 9 wins. 9 wins this time, and they won 12. The next year, 2019, the over/under is 9.5 wins, and they won 10. This is just going regular season.
Right.
The next year, 2021, it was 8.5 wins, and they won 10. And that was in the regular season. That was in the ACC with a schedule that only had 10 games on.
They only had 10 games, exactly.
And then last year, they were 8.5, and they won 11. And so every year, Notre Dame has surpassed what the over/under is. And in a lot of years, it's been by a couple games, 7.5 to 9. It's a game and a half. 9 to 12, 9.5 to 11, 8.5 to 10, 8.5 to 11. I mean, you're talking about not really that close, to be honest with you. And that's just including regular season. So there's always this kind of expectation, and I remember kind of mocking some of the stuff. There was the one guy, SP Plus, that came out with Notre Dame in the preseason top 25. He projected them to go 7-5, and I was just like, "What?
How does that make sense?
What are we doing here?
If you're 7-5, you're not in the top 25."
And then we had to. Well, that's even a dumber part. But this is the same formula that has LSU or had LSU ranked behind Ohio State and Clemson after the 2019 season was over. And LSU had won a national title.
Clearly the best team in college football that year. And it wasn't close.
Right. So anyway, the formula is a little flawed, but 7-5. And then there's all these reasons why. And so many Notre Dame fans last year bought into it. And it was how good North Carolina was going to be.
Right.
How good Wisconsin was going to be. This is the year that USC turns it around, right? It was a lot of the same stuff we're kind of hearing now, right? And it just was, and then it would be like you'd look for everything good about the opponent and then nitpick everything wrong with Notre Dame.
Right.
And it was just kind of a puzzling puzzing off season for me, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. And now we're kind of back at it where it's like, it's a little puzzling. And then the best part is the people who will say, well, an 8-9 wins. I'm a realist. Being negative doesn't make you a realist. You can be a realist who has a negative point of view. You can be a realist who has a positive point of view, but just being negative doesn't make you a realist. I don't think we understand what that term means. And so, as if anyone who thinks they're going to be good is like working outside the scope of reality.
You've got your rose-colored glasses on, right?
When I'm like, no, I'm just looking at what they've done the last 5 years with a mediocre head football coach.
Yeah.
And so to me, when I look at this season, Vince, it's a little bit of a head scratcher. I think the preseason rankings are pretty spot on. I think they have Notre Dame between like 6 to 8.
And I get that.
I can live with that.
I absolutely can live with that.
I kind of scratch my head at some of the teams ranked ahead of them.
Well,
but maybe I'm comfortable with 6 to 8. I just would maybe put different teams ahead of them, perhaps.
Sure.
But that's kind of what we get down to, right? Is we're going to hold Notre Dame to a different standard than we hold everybody else. Now, Notre Dame should be held to a different standard than everybody else in regards to what we're expecting from the football team. What I'm referring to is looking at a first-year quarterback being a concern for Notre Dame, which makes it really problematic when they travel to Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, that's where North Carolina is, right? Didn't they just lose a 3-year starter quarterback who was more productive than what Jack Cohn was?
Yeah.
Right. I'm pretty sure that's the case, right? Well, and then we just kind of go through this over and over again.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And that's kind of where this came from, is like, okay, let's talk it out. Right. Let's talk it out. Let's talk about where Notre Dame is, where Notre Dame should be. What are the legitimate reasons for concern?
Mm-hmm.
What are the legitimate reasons for why you should be excited about this team? And then ultimately, Vince, to where do we fall on? And then we had a great super chat from Kevin Carter earlier, too, which I really appreciate, Kevin. We will get to that, too, at the end when we dive into the mailbag.
Yes, absolutely. You'll be the first one in the queue, my friend. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
So, Vince, let's dive first into sort of the reasons to be a little bit concerned about this team.
Okay.
And I think the first one is obvious. You have a first-year head coach, and say whatever you want about Brian Kelly, whatever he was doing, right? Whatever Brian Kelly was doing and sometimes not doing, the result the last 5 years was 10-3, 12-1, 11-2, 10-2, 11-2, right? So, I mean, it was working. You've got a 36-year-old first-year head coach at a school that, if we're being honest, Vince, hasn't had great success with guys who have never been head coaches before.
Sure.
Right? And so I think that's where a lot of the concern, understandable concern, comes from. So I think that's the first area where if you're going to tell me you're concerned because you think Marcus Freeman needs to prove himself, okay.
That's fair.
I can understand that.
Now, I would push back a great deal on if your evidence is the Oklahoma State game based on his head coaching experience, right? I would push back on that because, number one, it was a completely different staff. There were very many extenuating circumstances that had to do with that game. So you can have your reservations about him as a head coach because he's never been one, and I'm fine with that. I will not push back on that. But if the next sentence out of your mouth is because of what happened in the Oklahoma State game, then I have an issue, because I'm sorry, that is not indicative of, I think, of how he's going to be a head coach. First of all, only 3 weeks on the job. It's a completely different staff. I think, and this is my opinion, I think he was testing some of his staff as well.
I've been told that.
And I'm not going to get into specifics, but I think there was some, hey, this is your call. You know what I mean? Let's see what you can do. And it was kind of an on-the-job training situation, or a interview, I should say. Now, that's not something that you obviously want to do, during the regular season when it's your job, it's your staff, etc. That's not how you want to go about things. Would I have done that? Probably not, but I wasn't the one making the calls, right? So I will say, look, if you think that he's going to, if that's a question mark for you because he's never been a head coach, totally fine with that. I'm totally fine with it. I'm 5 years older than he is, right? I mean, that comes into play.
Sure.
But I'm sorry, I can't use the Oklahoma State game as your reasoning. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and I guess my point is if you're going to use that as your reasoning, then you need to look at the whole thing, not just the second half, right? I mean, it's 2 halves of football.
Yeah. Good point.
And yeah, the blown lead was problematic. I'm not someone who just is going to dismiss that, right? Like I'm not. I think that we should, and you're not either to a degree. It's just when that's all you're focusing on, right?
Correct.
That's my concern.
Correct.
And I think the Oklahoma State game did show something. It showed that the program had fatal flaws that led to it being a team that could not beat a team that was superior coached and superior in the trenches. That's what that game showed us last year. And the reality is you had a situation where you had a defensive coordinator that had really led that team into a lot of success. Notre Dame's defense the second half of the year was outstanding. And they choked the game away, but they weren't being led by the guy who had built that defense the whole year. It was a different scenario, different situation. Right. And so you've got to take that into account. You look at the offense and the fact that you had an offensive line coach that just flat out could not generate a run game against a defense with a pulse. That just was a reality last year. Well, that has been corrected, right? You've brought in a more experienced defensive coordinator. You've brought in someone who I believe is a more talented person for that job than the person who did it in the bowl game, with no disrespect intended to Mike Elston. You've brought in a much improved offensive line coach. So that's the other thing, is if you're going to say, okay, the bowl game is a concern, you lost to a top 5 team by 2 in a game that wasn't necessarily as close as the 2, because Notre Dame did score late to make it 2, but also a team that when early on your team was rolling. And that's the part that I don't think people miss, is because that team came out smoking.
Yes, they did.
And I think you should, that to me is indicative of, okay, this is what this Marcus Freeman tenure is going to be about. To me, that says more about Marcus Freeman than what happened at the end, because that had a lot more to do with the preparation. The inability to kind of, put that game away is to me indicative of they just didn't have a staff good enough to do that. And, we've heard people talk about, what he should have done. Like you said, Mike Elston, that was an audition for Mike Elston as the defensive coordinator.
Correct.
And so if you're Marcus Freeman, like, well, let's see what he does. Let's see what he does. Let's see what adjustments he makes. Let's see what he can do here. Let's see what he can do there. And by the time he kind of stepped in and said, okay, it's time to do something different, it was too late.
Right.
And that's basically kind of the reality of it. And again, Kenny Moore just said Freeman put way too much faith in Mike Elston. I don't think that's how it was. It wasn't so much faith. It was like, okay, you want this job. Let's see what you do.
Show it to me. Yeah.
And you needed to do that, because in the lead up to the bowl game, he was being dragged in this direction, that, all these other different things as the new head football coach. And so I do think there's some concern, but at the same time, I think we're putting too much emphasis on that bowl game.
Right.
The other thing that we're ignoring is let's not act like every time Notre Dame had been in that position in the past, they got blown out. Top 5 team, major bowl game. When was the last time Notre Dame was competitive in that type of environment?
That's fair.
And that's the other part of it too. So yeah, that was a disappointing loss. And if you just would have made that one stop at the end of the first half, maybe we are having a different outlook. And it just kind of goes back to like what we've talked about before, Vince. No matter how good your season is, if you end on a loss, you're going to have a lot less momentum emotionally than if you end on a win.
Oh, no question.
And that's something that went into it. But
there's not many sports out there where you can end your season with a win and not win a national championship. You know what I mean?
Right.
Most of the time you're losing, and that's your last game of the season. Right. And almost all levels of sport, unless you don't make the playoff, that kind of a thing.
But the exceptions are in teams that don't make the postseason,
right?
Or in college basketball, you make some tournament nobody cares about.
Exactly.
Right. And so I think the youth of the coach is understandable. I think the fact that a lot of people are going to focus on a first-year quarterback is another reason. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, because we're going to talk about the quarterback aspect later. But there's the quarterback discussion is interesting, Vince, because with a lot of people, it's not like, well, first-year quarterback, I want to see how he does. It's with a lot of people, there's an expectation that he's not going to play well.
Right.
That's a little bit puzzling to me. And that's where I think a lot of the negativity comes from. It's okay to question, how's Tyler Buckner going to do? Because if you're not doing that, in our shoes, that would make us not objective.
No question.
Because they're going to ask him to do things he wasn't asked to do last year. We don't know how he's going to do it. He hasn't really been that guy since the 2020 season, the 2019 season, correct? No, hold on a second. 21 freshman, 2019 is the last time Tyler Buckner was able to
Starter,
be
when he
a
was the
full-time
guy.
starting quarterback.
Yep.
That's all understandable. The question now is your expectation of him wrong, as opposed to it's one thing to say, hey, he's got to prove something. We should all be able to say that. Whether you're pro or not pro Tyler Buckner, you say, hey, he's got a lot to prove. The puzzling thing, though, I go back to, Vince, and you'll see it in this chat. Just watch this chat. It happens every time Tyler Buckner's name's come.
And it's already been talked about today.
Is just the expecting he's not going to be good, and that's part's puzzling. There's the concern is understandable, but the thought that he's going to struggle is the part that is a little bit of the head scratcher for me.
Well, and look, they've got a new quarterback. They got a brand new quarterback who's never started a game in his college career. He didn't have a senior year of high school. He was asked to do a very small, package last year, as far as being a quarterback. He wasn't asked to drop back and throw. And when he was asked to do that, it's not even something that he really practiced in practice. So you're asking him to do something that he was not prepared to do, which is not okay, in my opinion, to bang him because he wasn't good at something he didn't practice. Okay.
Right.
Football is a 1 game a week, 6 days of practice situation. And if you don't practice something, you're probably not going to be good at it. Now, with that said, he's brand new. We don't necessarily know, but here's what we do know. It's a top 100 recruit. I would say, depending on who you're looking at, it may be higher, but he's a top 100 recruit. He's a really good quarterback when Notre Dame brought him in. He didn't have a senior year of high school, right? But I think we forget how highly ranked he was,
right?
Because he was in Notre Dame's class for so long, number one, because he was one of those early, commitment guys. Then he didn't have a senior year, so we kind of forgot about him. And then he had the limited package last year. People forget how good this kid is. That's what I will say. And are we projecting that he's going to be really good? Yeah, we're projecting.
Sure.
Because that's what we do.
Just like we did last year with Bryce Young and
absolutely
DJ Stroud.
Absolutely. And the difference between him and some of these other guys is he did have some quality experience last year, which those guys didn't have. And so, yes, we are projecting that he is going to be something. I just what boggles my mind is just the severe negativity surrounding him based on a microcosm of things that happened last year. That's my issue.
It's what it is Vince. It's kind of like the bowl game. We can have an honest conversation about the things we liked from the bowl game and things we didn't like from the bowl game. The problem is that there's some people that only want to focus on the good things we saw in the bowl game, and there's even more people that only want to focus on the negative things from the bowl game. And that's the thing with Tyler Buckner. There are some people who literally will not will only address what Tyler Buckner did in the last quarter and a half against Virginia Tech and then ignore everything else he did the entire season.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's like, that's where I'm kind of like, you're being a little bit purposely negative here when I don't quite understand why. Because the problem is we can't have an honest conversation if that's all you're going to do. Like, where was the comment up here? Like, this is from Jules. Do you think we have more talent that can make up for TB mistakes? Like, there's just assumption he's going to go out there and make all these mistakes that
he's going to be. He's going to be the anchor that holds back the offense, and he's got to have people
enough
around
talent
him
to overcome how bad he's going to play this year, right? Like, that's the premise of the question, and I don't understand that. I really don't understand that. But I do think, however, that people who say I can't jump on board with Notre Dame being a playoff team until I see what Tyler Buckner can do. Totally fair.
Okay.
Totally fair.
I am fine.
I don't think, I can't predict Notre Dame. I'm saying this for people. I can't predict Notre Dame to beat Ohio State because you're telling me that Tyler Buckner, who's never started a game, is going to go on the road in Columbus and beat CJ Stroud on the road. I can't go there. Okay, cool. Very fair. Yeah. Very fair.
Absolutely.
If you were going to tell me he's going to walk in there and outplay CJ Stroud and they're going to beat, I'm like, okay, Homer boy, take a chill pill. Like, you know what I mean? Like, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Right. So there's two mistakes we can make. I think that we can have a conversation about Tyler Buckner. And I think the other thing too is, I think another mistake people have is, Vince, you brought this up during the pre-talk, was when we were talking off the air, was there's a lot of people concerned about the Ohio State game. I think that leads to a bigger concern that people have, which is there's a lot of people that still believe, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that Notre Dame cannot make the playoff unless they go undefeated. There are people who think that, like, oh, they can't. So if they go on the road in the opener against Ohio State and lose, season's over.
Well, that's the argument for being in a conference too.
Right.
That, you know what I mean? That's like, well, they got to go undefeated in order to make the playoff if they're not in the conference.
Zero evidence of that.
Yeah,
Zero evidence of that.
Well, here's what they'll say. Well, they went 11-1 last year. They didn't make it in.
Right, because they didn't beat any ranked teams. And they'll ignore that they went 10-1 the year before, got their brains beat in by Clemson in the ACC title game and still made it. And the fact that they climbed all the way up number 3 in 2017 with a loss to Georgia at home in the second game of the year and still climbed all the way up to number 3 before losing again. They climbed up to number 4 before playing like garbage and then losing again late in the year in 2015. So the reality is that there isn't this they have to go undefeated standpoint. I think the only concern I have about the Ohio State game that is valid is not so much winning or losing, is what does it do to this team's psyche if they go and get blown out? And the fact that we would even bring up that conversation is not, I don't view that as BK PTSD. I view that as a legitimate question about Marcus Freeman. Is your goal is to turn the corner as a program. That's the biggest corner that you have to turn, essentially, or the biggest obstacle you have to overcome is, can you get this team ready in the biggest moments to come out and play and go toe-to-toe with the best teams in the country? That, to me, Vince, is going to be the biggest question mark that I have about this team is, can he overcome that? All the culture change we've talked about, can he get his team emotionally and fundamentally and technically ready to play in this game?
Yes, absolutely. And that's going to be the biggest thing, because that's what they've been missing in the past.
Right.
This is college football. There is emotion involved. This is not the NFL. It will never be I shouldn't say it'll never be the NFL. But you're dealing with kids, frankly. Okay. Emotion is part of the game.
Mm-hmm.
You can approach it businesslike, but there is emotion. You can't just dismiss the emotion. Okay. And that's been the problem with a lot of the Brian Kelly misses, in my opinion, is the lack of emotion. It's a business trip. It's, we're just going to do this. It doesn't matter who we're playing against.
No, it's not a business trip.
It does matter who you're playing. Yeah, it matters who you're playing. It matters, you have to be ready for bigger games. Playing against USC in the Horseshoe is a heck of a lot different than playing, Ball State at home. It's different, and you need to prepare differently for that. You can't prepare the same for both. You can't. And that, I think, was one of his biggest downfalls.
Right. I think when I look at some of the other concerns, Vince, there are a lot of unknowns. When you overhaul your coaching staff with 7 people, there are a lot of unknowns.
Sure.
Is Harry Hiestand going to be able to get this line back to the way he was before he left? Is Tommy Rees going to be able to take a step forward as a coordinator?
Big
Remains
question
to be seen. What kind of impact is Chancey Stuckey going to have as your receivers coach? When you look at Dylan McCullough, Lance Taylor did a really nice job at Notre Dame.
Absolutely.
Can Dylan McCullough overcome that? Al Golden hasn't called a defense since 2005. Charlie Weiss's first year at Notre Dame. What's he going to be able to do calling a defense? There's Mike Elson had done a really solid job at Notre Dame for years. Is Al Washington going to be able to live up to that standard? I think those are all very fair questions.
Those are valid questions.
If we're talking about those things, and I'm saying, okay, yeah, that's valid. I think those are things that you look at and then bigger picture with all that is, how quickly can this staff come together?
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a big part of this for me.
That's huge.
Right. Because, and why does that matter, Vince? It matters because as you look at the communication, as you look at, does Tommy Rees trust in the opener against Ohio State? Does he trust, Chancey Stuckey's advice? Does he trust Dylan McCullough's advice? Is he going to trust Jared Parker's advice? When they're having conversations about, hey, look, this is what I'm seeing, this is what you need to call. Or is he going to try to do it all on himself? Is Al Golden going to have that confidence and trust with Al Washington or Mike Mickens and Chris O'Leary and all those other different people? I mean, that's the biggest part of this whole thing, Vince, is being able to look and say, hey, is this something that we can overcome as a staff? I think that to me is arguably the biggest question mark, because that is an even bigger question mark to me than Marcus Freeman's inexperience.
Okay.
The reason I say that is because if the coaching staff can really be cohesive, there's a lot of proven talent in that coaching staff.
Yes.
If they can come together as one unit and answer those questions, then Marcus Freeman doesn't have to be this guy that goes out every day and makes all these brilliant calls to manipulate Notre Dame to victory in games where they're going to be the more talented team on the field 10 out of 12 times this year.
Sure.
Right. And so in order to think Notre Dame's going to be worse than 10-2, you have to think that Notre Dame is going to lose at least 2 games to teams with equal or inferior competition.
Yes.
That's what you think. He's going to be such a drop off from Brian Kelly that they're going to go out this year and just start losing to teams that have inferior talent.
That they should beat, that they should be,
right.
Right. Yes, they should be favored to win. Right. I mean, that's
right.
And I think that, the staff questions, I think those are legit questions as far as coming together. And I think in the past, we've seen, at least on the offensive side of the ball, young guys not necessarily getting a shot, no matter what. I guess I'm speaking more towards the wide receivers, things of that nature. How is the staff going to deal with young guys? Are they going to be able to develop these guys? Are they going to be able to take some of these veterans that have been in a different system for so long and coach them up in one offseason and get them ready to play at a high level? Those are all legitimate questions. I have no problem with those legitimate questions. The difference is, for me, is I have seen with my own eyes the coaching that is taking place. Right. And I think that speaks to me. And so that allows me to project in a positive manner some of those questions and dismiss some of those questions. And I will also say the manner in which that Marcus Freeman put his staff together, I was a real big fan of. It was clear to me, and because he was very methodic on some of these coaching hires, right? I don't think he went and found a bunch of yes men. Al Golden, for example, being the prime example. He's a former head coach. He was in the NFL. I mean, he could stay in the NFL if he wanted to and make a fine living without recruiting and all of those different things. But he brought him in to not only run the defense and not run Marcus Freeman's defense, run Al Golden's defense, right? With some similarities and things like that, but to run his defense and also be a sounding board as a former head coach. Not a lot of guys have I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but a lot of head coaches don't have that. They're not going to bring in a guy who might question some of their moves or, things like that. They're not going to do that. They don't want that. They don't want anybody to question their power, right? Marcus Freeman didn't bring in yes men, right? Tommy Rees isn't a yes man to Marcus Freeman. There's no reason for him to be, right? I don't think these coaches that he brought in are there to just do Marcus Freeman's bidding. That's not why he brought these guys in. So I'm really excited about what the staff is. You make a very valid point that individually, I think they have a really good staff. Like if you just go from position group to position group to position group, I think it's a really good staff. How are they going to work together as a group? I think that's a legit concern. Or I shouldn't even say that we use the word concern. It's a legit question mark. And while I can project and think that they will, because I think they're really good coaches, we don't know the answer to that. We don't. And I think that's a question.
The unknowns are the biggest thing that I look at and say, well, I just don't know how good this team is going to be. I think the debate that I would have is I think the floor that some people are setting is way too low.
That's where we can both agree.
Because to me, it's like the concerns are why 10-2 is the floor. Like if those concerns get answered positively, they're not going 10-2. They're going to be at worse 11-1, right?
Right.
And that to me is kind of where I come from. And here's another unknown: skill players on offense. Who are the playmakers going to be?
Sure.
Now you and I could sit here and do this long show, and hey, guess what? We did last week.
Yes, we did.
About how Chris Tyree and Lorenzo Styles and Braden Lindsey and all these guys, and Deion Colsey and Tobias Merriweather and all these different guys have the talent to become impact players. How Tyler Buckner has a chance to be this and that. And that all is true. They all have that ability. But that's a lot of what ifs that have yet to be proven.
No doubt.
And I think those are now, again, I don't think those are for me, aren't really concerns because I've always said I trust the talent if the coaching is correct. So it all boils down to the coaching question. I think if you look around the country in really last 7-8 years especially, you've seen a lot of teams with a lot of youth on offense be really good.
Yes, absolutely.
And a lot of it is you're relying on your God-given ability, but is it being harnessed? And I think that's been the issue for Notre Dame in the past. So it all boils down to what I think at the end of the day, the concerns and the reason why some people may be concerned and some people are more positive is it all boils down to what was your opinion of Brian Kelly and his coaching staff?
Absolutely.
And if you're someone who felt that Brian Kelly and his coaching staff were a group that were getting the most out of this team for the most part, then you're going to be understandably concerned about this season. If you're someone like me and Vince, and you believe that Brian Kelly's teams underachieved to their talent level, then you're going to be less pessimistic about the season because you
Right,
think the
right.
talent is finally going to be unleashed. And I think that's the biggest question that we're going to have answered one way or the other during the season.
Agreed.
Is that right there? Now, I'm not saying which it's going to be. I'm just saying whatever side of that debate you're on, we're going to have an answer by the end of the season, in my opinion. And so that'll kind of be really what this boils down to. So, Vince, let's discuss some of the reasons to be optimistic.
Okay.
And I think this is the one that a lot of people simply just whiff on. And I don't know if it's because they're obsessed with recruiting rankings. I don't know what it is. But Notre Dame's talent level is, in my opinion, they have one of the 5 best rosters in college football. Just looking at just God-given physical ability, right? Take experience and all that. I'm just pure talent. To me, this is one of the 5 best football teams in the country. And no matter what metric you use, it can be backed up on that. Do they have high-level talent? Well, I just put out the other day that when you look at the Walter Camp All-American Award, they tied Bama, Ohio State, Georgia, and Clemson for the most All-Americans on the first or second teams.
So high-level talent, check.
Right. And you look at, I've seen 4 different Notre Dame players get predicted to be first-round draft picks in next year's NFL draft.
Check.
Right. You've got preseason rankings talking about arguably Notre Dame's worst unit last year was the offensive line. And there's one preseason magazine that thinks they're going to be the best offensive line in the country, and another has them at like 5th.
Right, exactly.
Right? You look defensively. Everybody's concerned about, a lot of Notre Dame fans are concerned about the secondary. Why? Because they watched the bowl game. Understandable concern.
Sure, I get that.
And yet another magazine has the secondary ranked as the 4th best unit in the country coming back next year.
Right.
And so it's interesting when you look at a lot of teams. I've had Michigan fans come at me, and if you ask Ohio, and this is not a disrespect to Archer because I've found him to be a very fair person, but if you look at the responses that we get on our YouTube page from Ohio State fans that just come on, they either have the best roster in the history of college football the last 3 years, but their coaching must suck because they have better players than everyone at every position around the country, but yet they don't win titles because apparently Ryan Day's an idiot, I guess. I don't know. But like you look at Michigan fans and all these different, like they all think their team is underrated and is going to be this. And yet then there's Notre Dame fans who have to be convinced that their team is actually good. You know what I mean? It's
You've
the
been
weirdest
browbeaten
thing.
enough. You just believe
It's the weirdest thing. And that's the PTSD.
We've been gaslighted by Brian Kelly.
Roster.
We've been gaslighted by Brian Kelly for so many years that we don't know what it's like. Okay.
Yes.
He tells us, he would get up in a microphone and tell us,
Right.
we're going to do the best we can with what we got. The offensive line's not very, or whatever. The excuses were abundant, and we're just like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. And if it turns out to not be that way, then clearly you're the coach of the year. So
Right.
that's what it was, and we've heard it for over a decade. We've been gaslighted to believe that Notre Dame can't be good. That's what it is, right?
Right. Well, and if you look at, like I was looking at a thing earlier today, Notre Dame tied for 7th in the country. If you look in the last 5 years, they tied for 7th in the country with Clemson, by the way, for most NFL players drafted in the last 5 years.
No talent, though.
No talent. None. And so you look at the teams ahead of them, right? Alabama, number 1.
Okay.
You have Ohio State, number 2. No surprises there. You have LSU, number 3. And let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 of them came after their title team.
I was going to say after the 19th season, they had a lot of talent on that
Right.
team. Yeah.
Right. 4 is Michigan, which I actually did find surprising. Talk about wasting talent. 5 is Florida. 6 is Georgia. And then Notre Dame is right behind Georgia, 1 fewer player than Georgia. In the last 5 years, Notre Dame has had 1 fewer player than Georgia drafted in the last 5. This is going into last season, right? Now Georgia has gone up because they had like 15 dudes drafted. Right. So this was going into last year is the earliest, like the latest I could find. And I think that it kind of goes to my point of there's this constant underrating of what Notre Dame's talent level is.
Yes.
And maybe it's recruiting rankings. I'm not quite sure what that reason is, but I think it's very true this year. I think a lot of people underestimate Like they'll talk about receiver. There's some people you cannot get some people to talk about anything positive about the receiving core.
No, because there's nobody there. It's all walk-ons,
Right.
Brian.
Yeah,
it's all walk-ons.
right.
Just
That's
no
what you think.
scholarships.
It's
I know.
like they're, man, I hope really Chris Fink, this is the year he becomes the go-to guy. You know what I mean? Like that's not the case. And it's kind of interesting, but I think this team has a really, really talented roster. And the important thing is they have talent at some very important positions. Now, in some instances, guys got to step up, right?
Absolutely.
They've got to. We're hoping that a top 100 recruit at quarterback can step up and be a really good player. We're hoping that a borderline 5-star running back can step in and finally fill the void. We're hoping that a pair of top 3, top 100 receivers can emerge this year and be good players. And if you're a recruiting rankings person, then you probably should be excited about this team because a lot of the guys stepping into the role are guys that were highly ranked players. And so, I think that's my biggest thing, Vince, is there's a lot of talent to me coming back on this football team. And that's my biggest reason for optimism.
And I will take it another step further. There's a ton of talent on this team. You've outlined it beautifully, but they're being coached by really good coaches.
It's funny. That's my next point.
Okay. Well,
O-line. No. Great segue. I have O-line receiver coaching as my next one. So yes,
it's funny. I was driving into one of the football camps into the stadium, right down the tunnel, and Coach Stuckey was walking out with his wife. Mm-hmm. And I was like, "Hey, Coach, great job with the receivers." And he looked at me like I was crazy.
Because you were like, "You don't understand what I've had to deal with the last 5 years."
It's like, I know you don't know who I am, but I don't care. But you look at Coach Stuckey is a projection because he's got 1 year of coaching experience at the D1 level at Baylor last year, and we all have expressed our not concerned, but it's a question, etc. But again, I've seen it with my own eyes. I feel very comfortable with what he's doing with the wide receivers. I feel very good about it, especially in comparison to what was there before. And then you go to the O-line. You're talking about a guy who has a track record. He has a clear track record of success, putting guys in the NFL, recruiting guys. The play on the field speaks for itself. They were literally the number 1 offensive line. His last year?
Yeah,
his last year as the offensive line coach. They were literally the best offensive line in the country.
And they had two of the best offensive lines in his last 3 years. Twice they had, in my opinion, the best offensive line in the country in his last 3 years.
Right. So he has a clear proven track record. So he's taking guys that were really good on the recruiting trail. I mean, I believe Jarrett Patterson was ranked as the number 1 returning center, even though he's probably not going to play center. Mm-hmm. So all-American type player. You got 2 really good, sophomore tackles with experience, etc.
Who played well last year in spite of bad coaching.
Exactly. So not only do you have high-level players, but you've got high-level coaching on top of it. And that is what gives me the excitement about this offense and thinking that this offense is going to take another step. Because they're going to be more balanced and they're going to be more dynamic in what they're doing.
I think this part of the conversation needs us to pull up a question that was asked earlier by 99 Problems of the BK81. He says, Brian, go ahead, Vince. I was just pausing to kind of, go ahead and read it.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And I'll bring up part 2.
So there's 2 parts to this. Brian, here's my concern. Call it BK PTSD, but I would love you to prove me wrong, please. If LY's team,
last year's team,
thank you. If last year's team plus the staff played this year's schedule, I think we're coming off of an 8-4 or 9-3 record. So if you adjust for that, and that's the new baseline, 9-3 would comp last year's record, and with a new staff and first-time head coach, who I think we're all very high on, but all first-year head coaches learn in year 1. You're gonna have to explain this to me because
so basically what he's saying is if this year's team or if last year's team played this year's schedule, meaning if the 12 teams they play this year they played last year, they'd be 9-3, 8-4. And again, I just say, based on what?
Right.
I mean, here's my thing. So like you look at USC sucked last year. They did play last year's USC team, and they beat them convincingly, even though they didn't play well. They played North Carolina last year, and they beat them convincingly and didn't play well.
Right.
Marshall, they'd beat Marshall. They'd beat Cal. They did beat North Carolina. They killed Stanford. They would have beat UNLV. They would have beat Syracuse. They did beat Navy, and they would have beat Boston College, and they did beat USC. So that's 9-3. So what you're telling me is that in your opinion, last year's team would have lost to not only Ohio State and Clemson, but also BYU and somebody else. So so the only options are BC,
right,
Syracuse, UNLV, Cal, or Marshall. Which one of those 5 would Notre Dame have lost to last year to go 8-4?
Sorry.
And why are we assuming that they would have lost to BYU? I mean, they had one common opponent. BYU beat Virginia pretty convincingly, 66-49. That's 17 points. Notre Dame beat them by 25. Well, they didn't have the quarterback. Okay. BYU gave up 49 freaking points to Virginia.
Right.
You know, BYU lost to UAB in a bowl game. They beat USC at USC by 4. BYU did last year. They lost to Baylor by 14. They lost at home to Boise State. How are they any better than Wisconsin?
Right.
Or Purdue last year? So, again, I think this is the premise of, well, look, last year's team wasn't good. We have said that for a long time. We said that when we were talking about how they might get into the playoff last year. Because if Georgia beats Alabama, Notre Dame's in the playoff.
They're in.
And they didn't play well all year.
If
coached well.
If Alabama had lost to Auburn in that ridiculous overtime, Auburn.
That's true.
They should have lost that game. If they lose that game, Notre Dame's in the playoff.
So the premise is, well, this year's schedule's tougher. Based on what?
The two high level,
and that's cool. I'm digging that, but there's a difference between this team would be 10-2 compared to 12-1. So Ohio State and Cincinnati wash each other out, right? They lost to Cincinnati, they lose to Ohio State. Last year's team would have got killed by Ohio State.
Agreed. Yeah,
they would have.
Yeah,
killed 17, 20 points is probably what would have happened, right? Because especially if they played early in the year, like when they did play Cincinnati.
And we're talking about with the BK staff or with
last year's team. So Brian Kelly with last year's team.
Yes, then I agree with you 100%.
So my point is this, though, to your question is, why are you assuming they'd be a 9-3, 8-4 team? Who would they have lost to that they didn't play last year? That's the thing, is there's actually a lot of turnover there's a lot of carryover in this year's schedule.
Yeah.
Notre Dame last year against teams on this year's schedule went, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4-0 against the teams on last year's schedule. Marshall and Cal, UNLV, Syracuse, Boston College. I just don't see a loss in it. So you'd have to, and then why are we assuming that Notre Dame would have lost to Clemson last year? Did you watch Clemson?
They were terrible. I mean,
they weren't good last year.
They were terrible for Clemson's.
They would not have scored on Notre Dame last year.
I agree. Now, their offense.
I think the game would have looked a lot like the Georgia Clemson game, because I don't think Notre Dame's offensive line would have got chewed up by Clemson last year. But you know what else? Clemson's offensive line would have got chewed up by Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And then it comes down to quarterback. With all due respect, I'm taking Jack Cohn over DJ any day of the week, based on how those teams played last year. So again, I don't understand why there's assumption that they would have lost these games, because again, they had a horrible O-line coach. Their receivers had no clue how to get off the press, and yet this team still went out and went 11-1. That goes back to what the original premise is. This is a really talented football team. Right. They were able to out-talent their way into an 11-1 record.
Yes, and that's exactly what they did. I agree with you 100%.
And so, and we've seen it in the past too, right? We've seen them, to me, when I watched the Georgia game in 2019, go back and watch that game. Notre Dame didn't have a great game plan that game. They just had, to me, they were equally, a very equal rosters in a lot of ways. There's one difference. Jake Fromm made big plays at the end of the game, and Ian Book did not. That was the difference between Notre Dame and Georgia in 2019.
Yeah.
And so, again, another game where Notre Dame was able to just
that was the one at people. Georgia? That was one at Georgia.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Notre Dame has just been out-towning people the last 3 years. So this goes back to what you were talking about, Vince, which is, if you believe that this is a much better coaching staff, then you should be pretty fired up about this football team.
Absolutely.
Because to me, that's the biggest difference, is this is a team that in my opinion has across the board a very talented roster. They're not where Ohio State is at the top level positions at on the team. So quarterback, receiver. But I'll match Notre Dame up against them anywhere else. If give them advantage or they're right there on it, right? I'm sorry, USC does not have a better roster than Notre Dame. What we're seeing is an obsession at quarterback. Well, Tyler Buckner versus Caleb Williams. Well, they don't play each other. Caleb Williams has to play the Notre Dame defense with the starting offensive line that he's going to have at USC this year.
Right, exactly.
Right? And Notre Dame's pounded USC several times in the last 5 years. And guess what? USC had high-level they had high-level quarterbacks and really talented receivers on those teams too.
Right. But I'm saying the domination starts in the trenches, and Notre Dame has had an advantage there on both sides of the ball for quite some time.
And so that's my thing is you have to convince me that Notre Dame's coaching staff is going to be as bad as it was last year or inferior to tell me that this is 8-4, 9-3 team. Now, 10-2 is a different deal because what's changed about this year's schedule is it's more top-heavy than last year's.
Agreed. Absolutely.
And that was part of the argument we had last year was this team does not play the schedule that you all think that they play.
Mm-hmm.
When we saw North Carolina in the top 10, we laughed.
Yes.
We laughed. Because you're telling me they're going to lose 2,000-yard running backs and a 1,000-yard receiver with Jay Bateman at defensive coordinator, and they're going to be a top 10 football team?
Better than they were. Yeah.
Hard pass.
Right.
Hard pass. And they weren't. They were worse than they were the year before. When we looked at the schedule and saw USC in the top 15, we're like – that was our reaction. When I saw Wisconsin there, I was like, wait a minute, hold on a second. Wisconsin sucked last year. You're telling me that all of a sudden they're just going to be better? Why? Because
they tried real hard to keep Wisconsin in the rankings for a long time. They tried real hard. And then when Notre Dame needed them to do something, they didn't, which was
they went lost to Minnesota.
Yeah, appreciate that, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for that, fellas. Thanks. But it's kind of like it's the same thing this year. Is the focus is on the top two teams, right? It's on Ohio
which I get. I get it. Those are massive games for Notre Dame.
But to me, the Ohio State and Washington thing to me cancels each other out. Or excuse me, Ohio State Cincinnati cancels each other out. Because you did lose to the best team on your schedule last year.
Sure.
So then it's, what about after that? And to me, I think that's where it kind of comes down to, Clemson and BYU are both really good teams. But look, we've argued this. It's kind of funny. Like, I've argued at the very beginning of the offseason, North Carolina could be a trap game. I'm someone who's advocating that I actually think North Carolina is going to be better than they were last year.
Sure.
But that's a long way away from saying Notre Dame is going to lose that game.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they haven't played a game that was in single digits against North Carolina the last couple of years. And they played a pretty good North Carolina team 2 years ago. With all due respect, this football team has way more talent than that football team did 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And the 2020 team. And yet they went on the road against a North Carolina team with 2,000-yard running backs, a 1,000-yard receiver, also had Josh Downs on that team, and Sam, I can't believe it, Sam Howell, and Notre Dame beat them convincingly. You know what I mean? And this year's team is going to, to me, is going to be, now, can they just show up and roll the ball out and beat North Carolina? No.
And we're not saying.
But there shouldn't be an expectation that they're going to lose that game. That's my problem.
Right.
And then I look at BYU. BYU's a good football team. That is going to be a battle. And this isn't meant to be disrespectful to BYU, but why are we thinking they're going to lose to that team? Based on what? What evidence do you have about BYU that makes you think that all of a sudden Notre Dame's going to lose that game on a neutral field? What evidence do you have? Their convincing loss to UAB? Their 9-point home loss to Boise State? Getting curb stomped by Baylor. Like, what is it about? They beat Virginia. Okay, Virginia was not very good. Notre Dame played like crap against Virginia last year and beat them by 25.
Yes, they did. And they didn't have their quarterback. I get that. And that was the scariest part of their team. I get that too.
But those receivers didn't all of a sudden, like,
right.
You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
They didn't stop knowing how to play. They couldn't get open against Notre Dame last year. And they still couldn't block Notre Dame's front, and that was going to be true no matter who played quarterback.
Exactly. That kid would have been running for his life.
Right. And so I also would say that Notre Dame would have scored a lot more on Virginia, because that's what Brian Kelly did. When he knew he had a team licked and he knew that they couldn't score on him, he would just kind of go into cruise control. He did that his entire tenure. He always did that. And we saw that. Remember the Miami game in his first year? Notre Dame's up 27-3 at halftime. They take a 30-3. Actually, I think they had a lead. It wasn't a 30-3 at halftime. It was at least 27-3, and they just coasted in the second half and won 33-17.
Right.
That game should have been like 52-10.
Was that the one that was at Soldier Field?
No. The one in the bowl game at the end of 2010.
Oh,
the Sun
gotcha.
Bowl.
Gotcha.
Yeah, they were up like 30-3. Like Michael Floyd had Harrison Smith had like 3 interceptions in the first half. Michael Floyd was going off.
Yeah.
Robert Hughes was making big runs. I mean, it started right away too. Like Austin Collinsworth runs like the first kickoff back like 30 some yards, and Michael Floyd goes down and kicks it, catches a touchdown pass. And I mean, they just were rolling Miami.
Yeah.
And then he took his foot off the gas. The Virginia game, Notre Dame could have hung a 50 spot on Virginia last year if they wanted to. And that was one of my frustrations with Brian Kelly. It wasn't like 21-0 at halftime, and he just kind of coasted. So to me, that's the other aspect of it that you look at this football team, Vince, is there's this thought of that this team lacks talent and all this, and I think that's just nonsense. So again, you're going to convince me who are they going to lose to, right? And why should we think that a Clemson team that went 10-3 last year is all of a sudden going to be better than Notre Dame? Why should I think that?
And they racked up most of those wins towards the end. I mean, it was a rough first half of the season for Clemson. Yeah. I mean,
they had one good win last year, and that was over Wake Forest. They dominated Wake Forest at the end. And they lost to Georgia. They lost to NC State. They lost to Pitt. They beat Syracuse by 3. They beat Boston College by 6. They beat Georgia Tech by 6. They beat Louisville by 6. Their blowout wins were over South Carolina, which was good, Wake Forest, South Carolina State, and they had a 10-point win over Florida State, and they blew out UConn. And then they went and barely beat a pretty mediocre Iowa State team in a bowl game that didn't have Breece Hall.
Right.
So, again, I just go back to why would you assume that Notre Dame would lose at home to Clemson last year? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so, to me, it just the entire premise of that is just faulty. And then the other is like, well, if they had last year's team this year, so well, I'd even be more excited because give me Jack Cohn with a Harry Heastand offensive line.
Oh, he can people apart. Are you kidding me? Let's go. Let's go.
Give me Kevin Austin with the receivers they have now. Jeez. And a real receivers coach. Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah. And so I guess that's kind of I just think this is a talented team. I think that Al Golden, to me, is arriving at the right time. And I talked to Coach Freeman about this when I sat down with him last week. And I'm still working on the magazine. I'm going to have a lot of that stuff in the magazine, and I'll have some of it out later as we get closer to the season. But, he talked about the fact that one of the things he liked about Coach Golden in the interview process was, number one, he hired him mainly because he didn't want to have to make a philosophical shift. He doesn't care about the X's and O's part as much. It's like, I don't want to make a philosophical shift.
Right.
And Al Golden is very much in the same philosophy of Marcus Freeman on how to be good on defense. But he said, you're talking about a guy, and we were talking about some of the games from Cincinnati. He's like, 1 week you're watching them play against the Titans, and they're in a pure 3-4 defense because Tennessee is a downhill, run the football, play action pass team. And then a couple weeks later or whatever, they're playing the Chiefs, and they're running a completely different defense and having success against the Chiefs. Meaning in the NFL, you're basically putting in a new defense every week. And you're not going to do that at Notre Dame. But what his point was is he's going to understand how to adopt a defense to just a completely different offenses. You're going to play, Ohio State 1 week, and then, their version of their pro style type of spread offense. Then you're going to have the air raid from Phil Longo. Then you're going to have the triple option from Navy. You're going to have all these different types of pro style with John McNulty and then USC's version of the air raid. But you're going to have a coach that understands how to adapt his personnel and his alignments and different things to those things. And I think that helps too. But at the end of the day, Vince, my biggest reasons for optimism, I go back to it. I think this is going to be a well-coached, talented football team.
Agreed.
And I think that's the thing that we're missing. And the other part too is Notre Dame returns a lot more production this year than it did the year before.
Right.
And that was the thing from the
SP
Plus
people realize that.
They were in the 120s last year.
Right.
They have far more production returning from this year to this year's defensive line than they had to last year's defensive line. And so last year's defensive line was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And this year's defensive line returns a lot more. Their secondary right now projects to be a lot better than it was last year, even with Kyle Hamilton.
You're getting a lot of returning tackles from the linebackers, too.
Right. And you're getting Maris Luafau back, which is a huge infusion. So I just look at it and I say, I don't understand why. Like, to me, 10-2, that's why I say 10-2 should be the floor.
Agreed. 100%.
There's no question. Now, can they be beyond that? And to we start talking about championships, that's a different question that we'll get into as we get closer to the season. But I think that's kind of where I kind of get down to this, Vince, is this is a team that has a lot of talent that is coming off a year in which they went 11-1 and did not play well, like almost the entire year. Even some of the games they won, they played like crap.
Yeah.
They went on the road and played like crap against Florida State and won. They played like crap at home against Toledo and won. They played like crap against North Carolina and won by double digits. They played like crap against USC and won by 2 touchdowns. They basically coasted against Virginia and won by 25.
Yeah.
Why? Because they have a lot of talent. And if you believe that this team is going to be coached well, then, you're going to be excited about it. If you don't think this team is going to be coached better than it was last year, then I understand your skepticism. At the end of the day, that's what it boils down to for me.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. And I'll tell you right now, 8.5, the over-under for total wins for Notre Dame at 8.5. That if you're a betting person and you don't take that, then I don't know what you're waiting for, to be honest with you. That's nutty to me. I will be placing another bet to make sure that I gain a little bit of money on that bet. Again, I'll throw my $20 or whatever down, but that 8.5, that again, it's one thing to look at a team and be like, you know what, that looks like a 9-win team or whatever. I think Archer, as an outsider, said it looks like a 9-win team to him.
Right, because he's still dealing in that. What we've talked about this.
Absolutely. And I
remember what Georgia fans were saying about Notre Dame going into the 2017 and 2019 seasons. Same thing. The same crap we're hearing from Ohio State fans is the same stuff we heard from Georgia fans. Y'all don't have speed. You don't have playmakers.
That's fine.
Who the heck is Chase Claypool?
Totally entitled to that opinion, and I have no problem with that. They were singing a completely different tune coming out of that game, Vince. Exactly. And my pushback would be, show me where the 3 losses are. Who are they? Who are the 3 losses that they're going to lose to?
Right.
Outside of Ohio State and Clemson, I have a hard time picking out that 3rd loss. Now, could something crazy happen? People get hurt. Of course. Absolutely. This is college football. This is sport. That stuff happens. But I have a hard time finding a 3rd loss there. And so because of that logic.
But they're going to get blown out by a team that gave up 45 points to Utah.
Right, exactly.
In a bowl game.
But because of that logic, 10-2 is my floor. Like that would be the absolute floor for me, losing to Clemson, losing to Ohio State, 10-2. That's my floor. And 10-2 gets you to a New Year's Six bowl and gives you another opportunity to get that monkey off your back. So 10-2 is my floor, and I'm going to have a hard time being pushed off of that unless something crazy happens.
So that's interesting. I mean, that's kind of where we're at. So our floor is 10-2. I think this team goes into November with a chance at a playoff spot. That's what I think the expectation. And again, when I say expectation, I don't mean big picture. What's the golden standard at Notre Dame, right? Because that's win all your games, right? I mean, that's the ultimate standard at Notre Dame is win all your games. I think they go into November with a playoff opportunity, which means 1 loss, no more than 1 loss.
No more.
And then it all boils down to you've got 2 games in November to prove who you are.
Clemson and USC.
Well, really 3, because I don't think the BC game is going to be a cakewalk either.
Oh, I don't think it'll be a cakewalk. I think the BC game could be a statement game, to be honest with you.
It's a statement game. It's a statement game wrapped around a trap game. That's how I
no doubt.
At it.
Yeah, right.
Because if USC is good, if what everybody says about USC is true, let's just work with that hypothetical for a second. That USC goes to the Pac-12 and the Pac-12 is not great, and USC doesn't play a super brutal schedule, if we're being honest.
They don't.
And they go out and they're able to, let's say they're a 1-loss team. So you look at their schedule, they play at Stanford, at Oregon State, at Utah, at UCLA. Let's just say hypothetically, at worst, USC is a 1-loss team, and that means USC is going to be in the top 10 at that point in time.
Because they're already going to be overrated to begin with. And
correct.
So that if they keep winning, then that will only,
Correct.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Let's just say hypothetically they lose to Utah on October 15th. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks and 4 games for them to climb back up to gain whatever ground they've lost, which they would have gained with their start of the season where they were going to go 5-0. They're going to start in the top 25. If they would go 5-0 under this theory of losing to Utah. And that's going to jump them near the top 10, if not in the top 10, right? So Utah drops them down to 20-ish, 18 to 20-ish.
I was looking at USC's over-under, by the way. For
what is it?
9.5.
9.5. A team that went 4-8 last year.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I was doing. I want to make sure you knew where I was. 9.5.
So
yeah. Okay.
So I think if USC is that good, then I could see Notre Dame looking past BC a little bit, thinking of USC.
Fair enough.
And that's another reason I say that there's going to be some emotion there. Got a former coach coming back, a couple former teammates coming back. One of which we think is a pretty talented guy that is going to have
sure
a lot to play for, and Phil Dracovic,
no doubt.
So I could see that, but again, November is where this team is going to prove its worth. If they have more than one loss going into the November, then we will admit we will have miscalculated this football team, barring something dramatic, like they had 9 guys injured for the BYU game and they lost by a field goal.
And it has to be
Tyler
really
Buckner, Isaiah Foskey,
dudes. Michael Mayer, like all these guys are down, and they're absolutely
right. And that's kind of where you are. So you look at that, say November's where this team is going to have their chance to prove themselves, because in November they play Clemson, BC, and USC.
But isn't that, as a college football fan, isn't that what you want?
Yeah,
like that's what I want. I want November, which is the last month of the season. I want my team to be in contention for the big pick, for the big game, right? That's, you can't ask for anything more. If my team can be in contention in November every single year, then I'm happy. Okay. Now I will also say, at some point you have to win those games, and you have to win it all. Okay, for me to continue to be happy. I don't want to just be in contention in November and always be disappointed in January. Okay, because that's been kind of the MO for the past since I was 8. Right. So that's not what I want. But at the very basement, at the very floor, I want my team to be in contention in November, and I think Notre Dame has that opportunity year in and year out. It's what they do with that opportunity that's going to make or break Marcus Freeman as a head coach.
Right. I think what this boils down to, Vince, it's actually kind of funny. I think outsiders have a more realistic vision of Notre Dame than insiders do. People like fans. I really think that's true. Because if you read the chat, there's a lot of Notre Dame fans that don't think Notre Dame's going to be a top 10 football.
I'm not reading the chat.
I know I had to put Vince on the chat timeout. That's where I think where I disagree with a lot of those prognosticators is I think they have Notre Dame kind of accurate, kind of right. I think they overrate some of Notre Dame's opponents.
Fair enough. Okay.
I can buy why you have Notre Dame 6-8 based on what the questions Notre Dame has to answer. What I don't understand is why you're assuming that Clemson is going to answer their questions, why you're assuming that USC is going to answer their questions. Well, and those are the things I would say.
Clemson has the track record of, I would give them Clemson the benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
I'm not giving USC the benefit of the doubt. I'm not ready to do that yet. So I would agree with. So I guess the way I look at it, going into the season, right? I think Notre Dame has an opportunity, like we just said, in November to be playing for a playoff spot, right? So 6-8. Like, I look at this Notre Dame team in the preseason, I'm like, okay, you know what? This feels like a 6-8 ranked team. Like, that's what it feels like, right? And you told me this is kind of how you talk about recruiting, right? Well, this feels like a top 50 recruit. This feels like a top 100 recruit. I'm not going to give you 99 other players that I think are ahead. So this feels like a 6-8 team. But then when you show me the teams that are above them, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, then that moves Notre Dame up, and that almost feels like a bit of an artificial ranking for Notre Dame. But I don't know that there's 5 to 7 teams that are better than Notre Dame. That's the difference. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm not making any sense.
No, I get it. I think especially when you look at Notre Dame having to play Clemson and Ohio State, it's hard for me to put Notre Dame in the top 5 if you also think Clemson and Ohio State are top 5 teams, and you think they're going to lose those 2 teams. Right. Totally fair. Yeah. Or of Ohio State, Clemson, and USC, you assume Notre Dame's going to lose 2 of those. 10-2 has Notre Dame ranked at the end of the year 6-10. Yeah, most likely, as long as they're not blowouts, right? Because they'll have win over BYU. They'll have beaten one of those 3 teams, and they'll have beaten some other teams. Like, I think BC's going to be better. I think North Carolina's going to be better than a lot of people are projecting. A lot of people have them outside the top 25. I think they're going to end up by the end of the year being a top 25 team. I think they're going to be better than they were last year. Still not anywhere close to where Notre Dame is at this point in time. I think Syracuse is a team I think is going to be better than they were last year. I don't know how much better. But at the end of the day, keep in mind, for all the focus on Ohio State and Clemson, Notre Dame has 3 teams on their schedule that won at least 10 games last year. Do you know that, Vince?
I did not.
Do you know that also their schedule, if you add all 12 opponents together, they have a losing record last year?
I believe
despite
that.
3 teams with 10+ wins on the schedule.
So you're talking about last year's team.
You look at last year's, this year's schedule and what their record was last year.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
There's 3 teams on the schedule this year that won at least 10 games last year.
Ohio
BYU,
State, Clemson, and BYU.
Clemson and Ohio State.
Ohio
State was 11-2.
I think I said BYU twice, but yes.
Yep. Ohio State was 11-2, and then BYU and Clemson are both 10-3. Despite that success, their overall record, their opponents combined for a losing record last year. So even if you flip USC and have them go 8-4 last year instead of 4-8, that's still a team that's barely over 500.
Yeah.
Or scheduled barely over 500. Yeah. Correct. Right. So to me, that's kind of where I'm at, Vince. I just don't think the schedule is as hard as people make it out to be after the first couple teams. And now, are there good teams on the schedule? Yes. But again, we're talking about why should we assume Notre Dame's going to lose to those teams?
Right.
Right. Like Notre Dame played like crap against teams last year and still won. Like there's people, Toledo and Virginia, but they won those games. That's the whole point.
Right.
They won those games. And the teams that I'm looking at this year aren't better than those teams that they barely beat last year.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I guess that's where I come down on.
I guess the difference is Notre Dame's going to need some of these teams this year to be ranked to help them out.
I think for me, if Notre Dame's 11-1 at the end of the year, and Clemson, USC, and Ohio State are anywhere close to what people think they are, they're a playoff team. As long as
they're 11-1, they've beaten 2 of them. So yeah,
exactly. Long as here's the caveat for me, you can't get blown out. I have a hard time. Like, to me, if I'm taking 2 teams with equal resumes and one team lost to a good team by 10 and the other team lost to a good team by 30, I'm taking the team that was more competitive in that game.
What's your definition of a blowout? Because right now,
it's got to be a game that's somewhat competitive. Okay. Like if Notre Dame goes and plays Ohio State and it looks a lot like the Ohio State, the Fiesta Bowl in 2015. It was like, 45-28, right? Okay. But it was never really competitive. Even though Notre Dame scored in the third quarter to make it 28-21, it was kind of like I compared to like the Michigan. What was Harbaugh's first year? And it was like 13-10 at halftime. And a buddy texted me. He's like, I think Michigan's got a shot. And I was like, dude, this game's not even close, right? Like the score was not indicative of how convincing Ohio State was beating Michigan up in the trenches. And then the second half, Ohio State just rolls them. I think finals like 42-13 or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can watch a game and it's like I feel like the Notre Dame Cincinnati game was like that last year. The final score of 24-13 was not indicative of how thoroughly Cincinnati outplayed Notre Dame in that game. In my opinion.
Agreed.
Right? It can't be like that, where even though it was an 11-point game, you did not belong on the field that day with a playoff team. Right? It can't be that. Now, if another team's just better, okay, they're better. And because to me, it's not point spread, because you could be down 7 and you get the ball at the end and here's a perfect example. Notre Dame lost to Georgia by 6 in 2019 in a game that for 3.5 quarters for 58 minutes up until that final drive was a close game. 7-point game. Notre Dame's down 6. Let's say that Ian Book throws a pick 6 on 4th and 5 and they run it back. And all of a sudden it's a 6-point game. That's not a double-digit loss to me. You were in that game for now that game would have been a wider spread than the Cincinnati game was last year, 11-13. But the Cincinnati game wasn't nearly as competitive as the Georgia game was, right? So I can't look at point spread. I have to look at how the game was played out.
Okay.
Gotcha. Ohio State last year only lost to Oregon by 7, but Oregon outplayed Ohio State for 60 minutes.
Right.
They just had no quarterback to put the game away. So it's got to be a game where it's like, they belonged. And then, as the year went on, they got better in some areas. And even though they lost by 10 in the opener, they were a better football team. Ohio State losing to Virginia Tech by 14. Ohio State got outplayed that game, but they didn't get destroyed. Like what I'm saying is it can't be Miami 2017.
Okay.
It can't be
over.
It can't be Michigan 2019. Yeah. It can't be something like that.
Gotcha.
If it's like last year's Cincinnati game and you clearly have one of the 4 best resumes, you're in, right? But if it's like 2017 Miami, I just have a hard time seeing a playoff team. And that was my knock against Ohio State in 2018. So I have to be fair. That's the reason I said Ohio State, as good as they were, even at 12-1 in 2018, I said they don't belong. They went on the road against freaking Purdue and got destroyed.
Right.
You know, like you have to be consistent, right? So if Notre Dame goes on the road against Ohio State and just gets dismantled, they'd have to have a clearly better resume than anybody else to be a playoff team, in my opinion. You know, or they would have to have an equally convincing win later.
Yeah.
So they'd have to go out and like just dismantle a good Clemson team the same way where you can say, hey, look, we're a different team.
Explain
now.
It away because that was in November. This was in September. Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of like what was it? You and I that were talking the other day, Vince, where we were talking about no, I was on Mark Rogers' show, The Voice of College Football, and he was talking about how you have to have a rule where a team with 3 losses can't make the postseason. And I'm like, yeah, but let's think about that 2016 USC team that went 1-3 to start the season, but by November could beat anybody. I mean, that USC team in 2016 by November could have played with anybody, in my opinion, outside of maybe Clemson that year, right? And so it's like you got to look at who they are, but at the same time, if the resumes are close, I'm kicking out the team that got blown out.
Right.
And so, that's why I say you've got to be competitive in that game. But if you are, you go into November with a chance to play for something. That's where Notre Dame should be.
Gotcha.
And then what do they do from there?
Yeah.
What do they do from there? That's going to be the big question.
Yep.
But I think I've laid out why I'm excited about this football team. And I think we also laid out some reasons why it's understandable why some people
I've got a healthy skepticism. Don't get me wrong. We
both have a little bit of PTSD in us.
No doubt.
Let's be honest.
No doubt about it. And it helps. And I will say I have an advantage over everybody that's in the chat. I'm going to go watch these guys in person, and I'm going to see something different, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's the attitude, whether it's the whatever, I'm going to see something different, and it's going to allow me to kind of take that breath and be like, okay, this isn't the last decade. This is different. Let's have some fun this year. You know what I mean? Like I do have that advantage, and I would love the fact that I have that advantage, and I'm looking forward to that. And I think a lot of questions are going to get answered before they kick the ball off on September 3rd, but there's still questions, and I get where people are coming from. I get it. I try not to push back a whole lot on people unless they're completely ridiculous. You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of questions. I feel like you and I are in a position to answer a lot of those questions right now. But again, it is still projecting. But I feel really good about that, and I don't go out on a limb very often. I know that's going to hurt us, Mike. Mike said we don't have Kane Madden this year, and he's right. We don't.
But that's the point, though. With all those issues last year, they went 11-1.
Yeah. Kane Madden was part of an 11-1 football team. Okay,
right. That was a stop and a score away from beating a playoff team at home. In a game they played like garbage.
And he blocked for a guy who got drafted in the NFL.
Right. So. Like, I really don't think fans I think a lot of our fans do. I don't think a lot of people really understand outside of maybe this group that I do think is pretty educated, just how bad Notre Dame played against Cincinnati last year.
It is ugly.
And again, it was just out talent. It was just their talent kept them in that game. I mean, it's just that Cincinnati
had a better roster than Cincinnati.
Right, top to bottom. The difference is Cincinnati had enough at the top where they could beat you.
Absolutely.
They had a quarterback that could make plays. They had a cornerback that could just embarrass your best receiver.
Correct.
They had enough guys that they could go out and
nothing to combat that. And
and
from a coaching standpoint is what I'm talking about. They had talent. They just didn't combat it in the right areas. So anyway.
So that's it, Vince. That's going to be it for this part of the show. We have a mailbag coming up, but before we move on to that, so nobody leave. We're not done yet. We got some questions to go. We have some really good questions too. Hit that like button, subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. And if you're listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. Sign up for the message board at boards@irishbreakdown.com. And of course, check out our content at irishbreakdown.com. Now on to the mailbag, Vince.
Yes, sir.
We have a lot of good questions, and we're going to kind of go through and find some more. So you're now allowed to remove the thing and find some more. But I do want to get into these questions, and we're going to grab the super chats first, but then we're going to dive into the rest of the questions because there's a lot of good discussion going on in the chat today. Actually, I want to bring up Kevin Carter's super chat first. Kevin, thank you very, very much for this, buddy. Appreciate you
as well. We appreciate it too. Yep. So Kevin says, with the gap closing secondary of 22 and 23 combined, as well as the safeties on the backside, if they all reach their peaks, could this be a possible no-fly zone group like the Broncos had, but obviously not at that level? Wow, he's hitting you from your NFL team and everything.
I love it. Yeah. To me, if we look at talent wise, it's got a chance to be pretty good. I don't know if it's got a chance to be that good right now. Like when you think of that no-fly zone, I mean, you're talking about Aqib Talib was a monster. Chris Harris was one of the better cover guys in the league that year. They just but here's the thing about that no-fly zone. Big reason why they were that good is because they had a phenomenal pass rush. You had Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, Malik Jackson was rushing inside. I mean, you had a great pass rush, and so Notre Dame did a lot Denver did a lot of off man, and they could then jump stuff,
Right.
because of how good the pass rush was. And so to me, if that's really more of what I'm coming from is it's the great secondary, really, really, really good recruiting in the secondary the last couple of years at corner. Safety's been a little bit more inconsistent, but. To me, it's if the pass rush is there, then sure, I could see that. But I don't know if I could say, Vince, that it's going to be like this elite, like best 3 to 4 cover group in the country. Like the no-fly zone kind of thing. It's got a chance, but I need to see another good year at safety in 2024 before I'm ready to get there, because that's the big thing is they didn't really sign a safety in 22. So you're hoping that Adon Schuler and Peyton Bowen both pan out. But the reality is the reason we talk so much about why recruiting is so important, Vince, is because somebody's going to get hurt. Somebody's going to not pan out. Not everyone's going to be what you hope that they're going to be as recruits. And so if Adon Schuler or Peyton Bowen don't pan out or get hurt, then, you're in trouble. And so I think that's kind of where I look at it is I'm not quite there yet, Kevin, but I'm close. If they can give me one more good year in the secondary at safety, especially, that's kind of why I think that they're, the thing that would keep them from that level, Vince. Here we go from God Country, Notre Dame barbecue and coffee.
I don't like that last part, but
he dropped us. We were in there for a little bit, I thought, weren't we? Maybe we got bumped.
Gross. All right. For a question, can you guys compare this year's Notre Dame team to national champions of the last 10 to 15 years? Are we on the same level?
Not with most of them, not yet. No.
I think that's fair.
I think that this year's Notre Dame team, if all the things that we think could go well, I think they could compete with last year's Georgia team.
Yeah, I do too.
I think they could compete with the 27th. I definitely think I'll say this. There's one for sure national champ, maybe two that I think they would have been better than the last 10 years. And they're Georgia this past year, maybe. But that Georgia defense was really good.
Yes, it was.
It's the 2017 Bama and 2015 Bama. I think this team would match up very well against, in my opinion. 2016 Clemson, in some areas Notre Dame is better. In other really important areas, Clemson's better, and the biggest being quarterback. Like right now, if Notre Dame was going to go play Clemson, I'd be a little nervous about that because, again, if we're talking about neutral field, is Tyler Buckner going to be able to outplay Deshaun Watson? I'm not sure I'm there yet, right? And so that one I don't think they would match up as well. The reason that I think Notre Dame maybe could stack up in that game, Vince, is I was never a big fan of Clemson's offensive lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this defensive line could put in work against that Clemson offensive line. 2015 Bama, I think Notre Dame could play with and beat. 2014 Ohio State, I think that team, the way that they were playing at the end of the year was phenomenal. I mean, that run game, and they had speed to, on the outside with Devin Smith, and you had possession receiver Michael Thomas, and you had Ezekiel Elliott. And then they were really good on the other side of the ball as well. And so I think that team, they would have had a tough time, in my opinion, in that team. It would have been competitive, but I don't think they'd have beat that team. 2013 Florida State was absolutely a brilliant football team. They weren't coached incredibly well, but you go back and look at the NFL talent on that 2013 team. 2012 Bama was loaded, but it all comes down to quarterback, Vince. 2011 Bama, I'll stack up against that team. That wasn't a very good team, in my opinion. 2010 Auburn, stopping Cam Newton, that might have been tough, right? But they were Cam Newton and a bunch of that year, so there's some teams they stack up against. But if we go more recently, this team has a lot to a lot has to go right for me to say they can compete with 2019 LSU. A lot would have to go right for me to say they could beat 2018 Clemson. I think they could compete with 2018 Clemson. I don't think they would win. Yeah. 2018 Clemson, I need to see some stuff on offense before I'm ready to say that. Because I think it'd be a closer game than it was in 2018. But would it be close enough where they could win? I need to see receiver step up. I need to see, because the one thing we knew about that team is they had two pretty good outside wide receivers that year. Will they have a Claypool and a Boykin this year? We don't know the answer to that question yet, right? Will they have a quarterback that can make the big throws down the field to win those games? That's a big question mark.
You think so? Yes.
Well, I think we definitely think he's good enough to where that would be a competitive game.
Right.
But
I need to see some evidence though too. Like I need to this team out.
And then what happened when Notre Dame lost Julian Love that game? They got torched.
Yes.
Well, they're going to enter the game right now with what we know of this team with that mismatch at the other corner spot. They don't have a Julian Love opposite Troy Pride and vice versa.
Right.
They have great Cam Hart, who's great, but there's a bigger question mark. So would they be able to? So I think there's enough holes in the team where I'm saying we're not predicting them to be the national champs this year.
No.
Could Notre Dame maybe sneak a run if everything goes right? Sure. But I think it'd be kind of silly to predict that everything is going to go right.
Win it all.
There are still some holes in this roster. There are still some depth issues on this roster. Like somebody pointed out, Notre Dame is a couple injuries at receiver away from not having a ton of playmakers on offense in order to win those games. Now, they're still going to beat most of the teams on their schedule with that. I mean, they beat 10 teams, and they beat Clemson in 2020 with Javon McKinley and Ben Skoranek at wide receiver.
Facts.
You know what I mean? Like, they're going to be all right. But to me, it's about, can they then go into the postseason and let's say beat Ohio State in a rematch? Let's say you're able to beat Ohio State in the opener and Ohio State runs a table and you get them in a rematch. You're going to be able to beat them in a rematch?
It's tough.
Are you going to be able to beat, Alabama? Are you going to be able to beat, Georgia? Are you going to be able to beat teams like that? If you only have 4 healthy receivers, well, it depends on what 4, right? I mean, but yeah, it may be tough because they may be worn down. So there are still enough holes on this football team to say they got some holes to fill, right? But again, they don't play. I'm looking at this. They don't play Alabama this year in this regular season. They don't play Georgia, right? They get Clemson at home. They don't play Oklahoma. They don't. I mean, there's a lot of teams that people think are going to be really good that Notre Dame doesn't play. So they don't have to beat those teams. They have to beat BYU. They have to beat USC. They have to beat North Carolina. Those are the teams they have to beat, and then we'll see what they can be in the postseason. I love this comment from I'm going to say New York List. I am an optimistically pessimistic realist. That is great.
A little bit of everything there.
That is really, really good. Very, very well done. Very, very well done.
Blake Ham says Kelly was a mediocre recruiter, but he was a really good game manager, in my opinion.
What is your thoughts on that, Vince? Because I never thought he was much of it. I guess I never thought he was much of a game manager. I mean, because I go back to I go back to the Tulsa game in 2010 where you're asking your true freshman quarterback who stepped in after your starter got hurt right before halftime and threw an interception as he was getting tackled to throw a go route into the end zone when you're in field goal range.
Yeah.
I think of a guy that runs a jet sweep to Chris Brown the first time Chris Brown had ever carried the football inside the 5-yard line against Northwestern. And guess what? He fumbled.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're up, you score to go up 11. And instead of kicking the extra point to go up 12, you go for 2, don't get it. Northwestern gets a touchdown, a 2-point conversion, and a field goal to tie it, send it to overtime. That's not good game management.
Right.
I mean, and there's a lot of examples like that. I never felt Kelly was a great in-game coach. Well, I think when Kelly got better at the end is when he just stepped back and just let them go play.
Yeah, exactly. And I also don't like the way he it bit him in the butt plenty of times when he would take his foot off the gas and he would just kind of play, he was Kelly's biggest problem. Well, one of his problems was he was too afraid of what people thought of him. He was too afraid of people thinking that he was running up the score or whatever. His public persona was super duper important to him. And that affected the way he called games and the way he did things during the game. And that was, I think, one of the biggest problems with him as far as being a game manager. I didn't like it at all.
Yeah. Yep. Agree. Let's see here. Matt Calthan, thank you for the super chat, Matt, very, very much.
For the Superman, I'm hoping for a 12-0. Long as we don't get spanked by OSU and Clemson, I would be satisfied.
I would say that against Ohio State. I would say that against Ohio State because it's kind of funny. You get some of these. I wish all Ohio State fans were like Archer, where you can actually have like a rational conversation. But there's just so many of them on Twitter and YouTube where it's like you say that you think Notre Dame's as good as they are somewhere, and they think that means you think Ohio State sucks. Right. And it's just like, I think Ohio State's really good. I think Ohio State's one of 3 or 4 title contenders this year. I just don't think that they're automatically going to roll into Columbus and beat Notre Dame by 40.
Yeah.
And that turns in with some Ohio State fans that make me think I think Notre Dame, if some things go their way, can beat Ohio State. I'm not predicting that they're going to, but I think they could. Right? If Oregon last year, a team that got blown out twice by Utah and lost to Stanford, can go into Columbus and beat them last year without Kayvon Thibodeau, without Justin Flo, I'm supposed to believe that Notre Dame is just hoping to not get blown out by 30. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just not there yet. But as long as it's a 4-quarter competitive game where a play or two here goes your way, maybe you win. Yeah, I'll be satisfied, but I'm not going to be satisfied if they then also lose to Clemson. Yeah. The way your talent is, you should not lose games at home. I don't care who you play. And if Notre Dame was playing at Clemson to start the season and a home against Ohio State in November, I'd have the exact opposite. I'd have the same point of view, but opposite teams. I'd say as long as you go to Clemson and it's a 4-quarter game and you got a shot to win at the end, like the Georgia game in 2019, I'm okay with that. But you better win that game against Ohio State in November. When you're this kind of team like Notre Dame has, no, you should not lose games at home. Now, I mean, you're going to play like gangbusters every time, but you should win.
Sure.
And I think that's where Notre Dame should be. I mean, they should not be playing at home the way they did against Cincinnati last year. They should not. And I don't think this football team will. I guess part of me too, Vince, I don't think people realized how much Notre Dame players were kind of checked out of what the head coach was saying and doing, and how much the head coach had checked out last year.
And the whole
I've heard people say that he had checked out before Cincinnati.
Wow.
I don't know if I believe that or not, but I've had people tell me that he was checked out really before Wisconsin. That's why he said the things he said to Joel Klatt about how this isn't our year and we're not a very good team. He was already setting the stage for his departure,
exit.
You know, right. And because he wanted,
That's what it felt like. If you tell me that after the fact, then I look at what he said to Joel Klatt, because at the time I was like, dude, what are you saying? Like, what is wrong with you? But now it's like, okay, well, it kind of makes sense.
That makes sense. He was politicking for a pay raise on top of the pay raise he had just gotten in the offseason. He wanted even more. Oh, he was mad he didn't get more money.
Yeah.
And he acted like it all year.
That definitely happened prior to Wisconsin.
And we knew that. We did know that. That is something that we talked about.
Yes, we did.
I didn't realize to the degree in which he was like, I'm over it. And he coached like it, to be honest with you. Because remember we talked last year, he was really weird in post like in press conference. Like he was really like he just had like a I don't give a F anymore mentality last year. So we'll see.
He did. Yeah. Scott Wolfel, thank you very much. Well, yeah, thanks for the question. Speaking of 22, with the injuries to the backfield and the depth at wide receiver, is it too late to add from the portal? If it's still an option, any names floating?
Well, it's not too late from a deadlines or whatever standpoint. As long as kids were in the portal before, I think it was like May 1st, as long as an undergrad was in the portal before May 1st, you can still get him if he's still in the portal. And because even if he's still with his current team, the only time you can't get him is if he withdraws his name from the portal, right? But you can still get a kid in the portal who's an undergrad if he was in there before May 1st. The deadline isn't to May 1st to get one; it's they have to be in it before then. And then if it's a graduate player, you can get him whenever. It doesn't matter when he goes in the portal. If a graduate player went in the portal tomorrow and Notre Dame had room for him, you could go get him. The problem, Vince, however, is that they don't have room.
Right.
That's the bigger question.
Yes.
They don't have room.
Issue.
Right. They've got to lose a couple guys before they get to that point in time. And that's that's kind of the bigger question is can they add a guy? In theory, yes. Can they practically do it based on where their scholarship is right now? That to me is the bigger question mark.
Yeah. That's a huge question mark because they're sitting at 86 right now. And I know you're confident they're going to get to 85. That's without bringing anybody else in. So that's a huge problem. The season, it has to be set when you start practice, right? I mean, that's a month away, so that's a bigger issue right now.
Right. Got a super chat from Coach Bent.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Appreciate it very much. What is the most important trait that each coach needs to improve with his group for his team to be successful? Example, releases versus press for the wide receivers. We're talking about this team specifically. Okay. Well, clearly that is for wide receivers. You nailed it. Like that is one thing that they will be very easy to understand if they do it. Okay.
I think for me, the even bigger thing is, Vince, even beyond the press release, because again, schematically, there's things I can do as a coordinator to overcome that to a degree.
I did that too.
I think just overall their lack of how to use their stem to get open, to manipulate defenders to get open was a huge problem. I mean, they would just literally like run straight and then like do their breaks. There was no understanding of, attacking leverage. Hey, you want to attack, you want to threaten him outside on this particular coverage. You want to squeeze down on his near shoulder on this one. It was just like, let's just release straight. And, and it was really kind of pitiful, to be completely honest with you. But, I think that would be the bigger thing for me, is that then press release would be next. Trait that each coach needs to improve upon. Quarterback, I think it's going to be timing as a passer is going to be a big one. That was an issue more so for Ian Book than it was Jack Cohn, but just throwing with better timing.
Sure.
Running back, it would be, to me as a unit, just being a little bit more patient as runners. I think that was something that was lacking last year, as you saw guys that were either too patient or not patient at all. They just bounce that sucker out. I understand it because the O-line sucked.
You want to get out of there.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to say mine, Vincent. If you have if you think it's something else, just jump in. Offensive line wise, it's really just about physicality. Yes, there's technical issues, but none of that crap matters. If they're not physical, it won't matter. Defensive line, counter moves. Linebackers and safeties both, tackling. Tackling.
Finishing. I would say finishing, but that I was going to say finishing for those guys. Yeah.
Cornerback, it's playing the ball down the field. And I'm not someone who's like, look to the ball, but you either need to look back for the ball and find it, or you need to learn to play the hands better. Because there's two ways to play the ball. One is when he looks, you look, find the ball. Some people teach that. I personally don't love that. The other one is play his hands. Whenever he shoots his hands here or here, you shoot your hand right through it. Right. And either way, they got to play the ball better. Vince, and then with kicking, make your freaking kicks.
I will say I'm not as worried about the kicking game as everybody else.
Yeah. I am.
I'm not.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there right now. Yeah. No, I agree with a lot of what you said. Playing the ball for the defensive backs, I think they're plenty physical. I have no problem with their physicality. I think the DBs are very physical, but playing the ball in the air is going to be a big one. They need. They brought up the no-fly zone, one of the question guys, and I appreciate that. I like that. I think that's a great mentality to have. Maybe look, I'm not going to be comparing them to the Broncos secondary like he did, but to have that no-fly zone mentality, they can learn a little something from Jaden Mickey in that regard, right?
Right.
I want that. I want Jaden Mickey's personality to be imminent, to all over those guys. That's what I want. Okay. So I agree. Playing the ball is huge for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say defense overall is I would use the word finish. Like they need to be.
Yeah, because that's where tackling. Yes.
Yeah, they need to be
for yeah. It's because explain what you mean by that, Vince. Beyond tackling, it's not just tackling, but there's more to it than that.
It's flying to the football, which I think they've done a better job of in the past. I think they're doing a better job of that. But that team defense, playing together, seeing and reacting faster, so you're finishing the play at that point. All of those different things that all encompasses finishing around the football, and I think that's super.
A perfect example. If Notre Dame finished at the football in the Fiesta Bowl, they win in a blowout.
Yes, no question.
JD Bertrand just bringing down Spencer Sanders on 1st and 10. It would have made it 2nd and 20, and there's no chance Oklahoma State converts at that point in time.
Absolutely agree. And they had him. They had him a few different times.
Yes, but on that drive, it was 28-7. First play of the drive, I believe, and he ends up scrambling for 20-some yards. And there wasn't a lot of time left. If you sack him there and you get the ball back, either A, you go up and it's 31 or 35-7 at halftime, or it's 28-7 at halftime and Notre Dame wins that game.
Yeah.
But when they made it 28-14, they start the second half with the ball. The next time you get the ball back, it's 28-21. It's a different ball game.
Sure.
And it's as simple as finishing at the ball. That is and we've heard Al Golden talk about that, about the importance of that. So yes, that's a very good one, Vince. If you're going to encompass the whole defense into one, a great point. Archer 452, our resident Ohio State fan. This is the one you were referring to earlier, Vince.
Yeah. He says, I think there are 6 games that are effectively guaranteed wins. I think 6 games could be losses, but I think Notre Dame most likely wins 3 or 4 of those, getting them to 10-2 or 9-3. And look, that is a very logical approach to Notre Dame's schedule. I mean, I'm not saying I necessarily agree overall, but I'm saying it's a very logical approach.
I would say there's more guaranteed. That's the only thing I say. There's more guaranteed ones on our schedule.
I don't think there's 6 that could be losses. I really don't, because that means that it could be 6-6. I don't see that being the case in any way.
I mean, Marshall, Cal, Stanford, UNLV, Syracuse, Navy, and Boston College. To me, I just don't see how Notre Dame loses those games. I just
that you just named, right?
I just don't see it. And and you could flip North Carolina and BC. I don't see how those games are losable games. Again, could they be more competitive? Sure. But losing them, I'd have a hard time with that.
Yeah. But I appreciate Archer is, like you said, he's a very level-headed guy. And I said something a minute ago that I actually thought was very interesting.
I'm not sure what to do with that because he is an Ohio State fan. So then I got to question all the sound decision-making.
I know. He said if Marcus Freeman can get the New Year's 6 off of his back, look out. And I think that's appropriate. I like that.
Yeah. We had a USC fan step in, Polamalu, and he said this, to be honest, I'm not sold on Grinch being what we need. And then Archer said, Polamalu is an Ohio State fan. I can tell you that Grinch's time in Columbus was bad, and we weren't sad to see him leave for Oklahoma. I think what people have to understand about what Lincoln Riley is looking for in a defensive coordinator, it makes a lot of sense why he took Alex Grinch with him. Because Lincoln Riley doesn't care about having a defense that holds team to 17 points or whatever. He doesn't. He just has proven that over and over again. Right. What he cares about is having a defense that forces turnovers. And that's his key. He wants you to force turnovers because he feels like if you can force a couple turnovers a game, we'll outscore people. And if you look at last year, they were 14th in the country in turnovers. In 2020, they were 18th in the country in turnovers. And I think those are the teams you look at and say, boy, those teams were that's what he wants. Right, that's what he wants. I think, and that's also why Oklahoma tends to get smoked in the big games, even worse than Notre Dame. For all the talk about how Notre Dame loses big games, they've never had a game like LSU Oklahoma in 2019. I mean, they could have hung 90 on Oklahoma if they wanted to. I mean, that was one of the most embarrassing games I've ever seen in my life. But they couldn't force Joe Burrow into mistakes, and when that happens, Oklahoma has no chance. Like in 2018, they couldn't force Tua into mistakes. And they could just never get, even though they had an elite offense with, to me, a special quarter. I mean, Kyler Murray in 2018 was special.
Yeah.
But the reason that team lost to Texas in the regular season and lost to Alabama in the postseason is because they just couldn't make stops. And that's one of my big issues with him. We have a super chat there, or super sticker there from Ray Panconi. Ray, I appreciate that. Ray. Very, very, very much. Got a super chat also from Toe Jam, 1992.
Freeman seemed very calm, almost too calm during the bowl game. Coaches have to find the approach that works for them without the luxury of time. How do you think he balances calmness and intensity?
I don't think you're going to see him change that at all.
I don't either.
Look, here,
who he is.
Yeah, intensity comes in your preparation.
Sure.
Because nobody was worried about his intensity when they jumped on Oklahoma State 28-7. Right. They came out of that thing on fire. It's like people are like,
didn't freak out. They wanted
and him yelling at the defense and getting in their faces isn't going to make them cover better or make better calls.
Right.
It's really intensity comes from preparation, and then the intensity comes from your sideline.
Yes.
Your sideline is where it's your teammates kind of lifting you up. It's your other coaches that are bringing the intensity and those type of things. I want a head coach, to be honest with you, that is calm.
Yes.
Unless his personality, I don't want Kirby Smart to be calm because that's not who he is.
Exactly.
Right? You have to be who you are.
You have to be who you are. Don't lose who you are. He doesn't need to be Brian Kelly. He doesn't need to be Kirby Smart. He needs to be Marcus Freeman, whoever that is. And from my interaction around him, I can't even say with him, but my interaction around, he's a calm dude, right? But he's gonna get his guys where they need to be, and they're gonna be just as intense as they need to be. Right. And I think that's fine because I want him to be focused on what's going on. He's a very analytical guy. It feels like he's always studying. He's always thinking about what's coming next. And you can see that because when he gets down like on his knees, like one of these, and he's just looking in at the game. Like, he's thinking about it. He's intense, but intense doesn't necessarily mean purple face Kelly. That does, there's a different kind of intense, right?
Right.
So I think that's the biggest thing. He needs to be him and nothing else. And I think he'll be fine.
Yeah. I agree, Vince. I think you're again, intensity is something that you build during the week of practice. It's about that's why he focuses so much on competitiveness.
Yes, exactly.
That's where intensity comes from, where everything is a challenge for you. He had less than a month to instill that for the Oklahoma State game against a team that was one of the best teams in college football that year. Now he's going to have 9 months to get that going now before the Ohio State game. And that's why I say you can, and Vince, and I've always been this way. I've always said I don't take a lot from I don't take a lot from what you learn about a team from bowl games. I think what's great about bowl games is the momentum you can have going into a season. That's real. But hey, they did this in a bowl game or that in a bowl game. I mean, that stuff to me only tells. I don't put a lot of stock in bowl games because it's so different. You have a month to prepare. Guys are opting out now. You're going to, amusement parks before games and, having bowling nights. I mean, stuff it's not like a normal regular season game. I just don't put a lot, unless there's something on the line. I don't put a lot of stock in bowl games. They're fun. I like them. Right. When I say don't put a lot of stock on them, I just don't put a lot of evaluative stock on them. Like, hey, this team did this in a bowl game, whatever,
Let me ask you a question. I know you've been in the booth most of your career as a coach, right? But how were you during game day? Like, were you?
Depends on whether I was in the booth or I was down on the field.
Okay, you different. Okay.
Yeah, when I was down on the field, I kind of viewed myself as the rah-rah. Let's because that was my role. Like, I was the one talking to the group on the bench. I was the one that was like instructing, like, hey, let's go, let's focus, let's get ready to go. When I was in the booth, I had to be the calming voice. Hey, look, we're fine. Here's what we need to do. Here's what we need to see. Now, it doesn't mean I wouldn't like high five and stuff like that with other guys in the box, but like, when talking to the players and acting to the players, it was like, hey, let's be calm. Like, now I was intense during the week of practice.
Yeah.
My whole thing is if you don't have your team mentally ready to play by Saturday, it doesn't matter what you say in the locker room before the game. They're just not going to be ready to play. And that's kind of how I always looked at it.
I was curious.
Yeah, your intensity came Monday to Friday. Saturday was about, let's be executioners. You know what I mean? Like, let's go out there and get this job done. Okay. And I mean that in both ways. You know what I mean?
I do.
Dave Valensky with a super chat. Dave, thank you very, very much.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks, Dave. If Notre Dame does not join a conference and still stays independent, what happens when the conferences decide not to play conference games because
non-conference games?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was going to say that didn't make a whole lot of sense. They decide not to play non-conference games because they're too big now. Who would Notre Dame schedule?
Number one, why are we assuming that's going to be a thing? When has that ever been a thing in college football? I don't know that that's ever been a thing. I think what will happen is here's what I think people think. There's going to be like this 24-team conference, and they're just going to play each other for 12 games. And I just don't see that. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
There's no evidence of that. There's no push for that. I've never heard any of these teams say, hey, let's build the SEC up to 24 teams and play no one.
Right.
They'll say, no, we'll play the Big Ten. But even then, they'll find some other teams to schedule. Yes.
Outside your conference and always will.
Correct. So now if we get to that point, Dave, to put, credence to your question, if you get to that point in time where that's the thing, that's one of the criteria we've always said we think would potentially cause Notre Dame to get there, because then there is no path to a championship because you can't schedule all enough. But I don't see that being a thing. I don't think that brings any value to those leagues. I don't think that brings any TV value to those leagues, because here's the thing. This is all about TV. And once you kind of shut everybody else out, then a lot of the country stops paying attention that you want to pay attention, right? So then it's just teams that root for your, just the people that root for your teams are the ones paying attention. So I don't see that happening. But if they get in that situation, then Notre Dame would join a conference. Those are one of the scenarios that we have said
absolutely
would result in Notre Dame being forced to join a conference. But there's no discussion of that right now, Vince. And that's the thing, is like there's a lot of things that Notre Dame fans are assuming are going to happen because of all this that just aren't they're not in the conversation
like at the moment. I mean, yes, could crazy things happen in the future? Yeah, they could. And at that point, then Notre Dame will adjust and they'll do whatever they have to do. Again, I will say, I said it a bunch last night when we were talking about it on the IB Sports Nation show, or IB Nation Sports Talk show. Notre Dame will stay independent for as long as they can. Okay, when it comes to access to the college football playoff, and access for their Olympic sports. Okay, they're going to stay independent as long as they possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
When they are forced to join a conference, okay, and by forced, I mean no access to being a national champion. When they are forced, there is going to be a bidding war. Okay, they both conferences or all three or whoever's in the mix to get Notre Dame, there will be a bidding war. Notre Dame will never lose their leverage. They will be able to join whatever conference they want to. And at that point, I'm driving up the price and I'm going to join whatever conference makes me the happiest if I'm Notre Dame. And by happiest, I mean all the criteria, and money is definitely those things. That's the way I see it going down.
We are so far away right now from Notre Dame being in a position where they're forced to join a conference. Now, that doesn't mean that Notre Dame might not decide that now is the time to join a conference. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we have some intel that we put on the message board yesterday, Vince. I don't know if you had a chance to read that about some of the things that I've heard. And basically it's that Notre Dame has not lost its desire to join a conference. And as of right now, I just don't think that's is going to be the case. So, barring something that we have not seen or do not know yet, then I just don't see that being the case as of right now. But if they get to that point, then they'll join a conference. And they'll still have the leverage because then there'll be a bidding war between the conferences for who wants Notre Dame.
I'm telling you, they will never – everybody's worried about Notre Dame losing their leverage. Good luck. Right. I just don't see that being the case. I'm sorry.
Another thing that doesn't get talked about when you look at Notre Dame's opponents is they say, well, Notre Dame overhauled their schedule. Well, so did a lot of their opponents. Ohio State has basically a brand new defensive coaching staff, brand new offensive line coach. Clemson also is another team that completely revamped its coaching staff this offseason, Vince. And when you look at Clemson, I mean, they have a new offensive line coach, new offensive coordinator, because Tony Elliott left to become the head coach of Virginia.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about
that. Yep. Brent Venables left to become the head coach at Oklahoma. And you've got a completely brand new staff. So Brandon Streeter was on the staff, but he was their quarterback's coach, and he's now their offensive coordinator. Okay. They have Thomas Austin as new offensive line coach. I do not believe he was a full-time coach last year. Their play caller on defense, Wes Goodwin, like 3 years ago, was like a personal assistant to Bruce Arians with the Cardinals. I don't mean that like as a coaching assistant, not like he was like running around like typing notes, but like he was like, he
was working
that kind of thing. Right. His, and he's now their D coordinator. You look at a lot of the different coaches, they're like, they got a bunch of former players. So like 1, 2, 5 of their coaches are former players. Another one of their coaches is someone who played with Mickey Kahn, played with Dabo Swinney at Alabama. So a lot of connections, right? So it's either going to go really well because he hired a bunch of people he knows, or he hired a bunch of,
I would caution some of that. I would give him he's like, it feels like he's taking a page out of the Brian Kelly coaching, like hiring of coaches.
Right. Now, again, so Clemson has a guy who's never called a game before, right? Oh, I'm sorry. He called games at Richmond.
The Spiders.
Yeah. Wes Goodwin has called one game in his career. From 2018 to 21, their current defensive coordinator for Arizona was the senior defensive assistant, which means he had an off-field role. Right. It was 2017, so it was longer than 3 years ago. 2017, he was the assistant to the head coach for the Arizona Cardinals. And I believe Bruce Arians was their head coach.
I believe that is accurate.
And so that's their decor. That's who replaced Brent Venables. And some people are worried about Al Golden at Notre Dame. Right. So, it just, anyway. So, and the reason Potatoes O'Brien brought that up, and I wanted to speak to that, and I forgot to pull his question up as we talked about that. But that's where that came from. Notre Dame's not the only team that's overhauling their staff. Now, the advantage Ohio State has is it's still the same head coach. It's still the same decision makers on offense and stuff like that. And their defense needed an overhaul, right? And so, but again, Notre Dame's not the only team that's got a lot of players who are learning a lot of new things. Connor Patton, it's your boy Vince.
Yes, Connor, what's up, my man? He says, didn't USC have a really bad recruiting class a couple of years ago? Will that hurt them this year?
I think it'll hurt them more than people think. And one of the responses I saw was, well, no, it'll be fine because they brought in like 20 transfers. I don't think the transfer thing is as great as I think some people are going to make it out to be. because I don't think it's good for a team in football to have a completely turned over roster.
And USC has a completely turned over roster.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cohesiveness that kind of goes into that. And again, a lot of the guys they brought in were dedicated towards a couple positions. They brought in a lot of receivers,
right?
Not just Jordan Addison, but they brought in Mario Williams and Brendan Rice from Colorado. They brought in Tyrell Bynum from Washington. They brought in running backs. They brought in some DBs. They hardly any linemen on either side of the ball.
And they're losing linemen and recruiting trail too.
Right. Right. And they have not recruited well recently, which is where the depth comes from.
Correct.
And I think that's what's going to hurt USC is they're not going to be a very deep team across, especially in the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we're worried about Notre Dame's depth at some skill positions, which is not good, but I'd rather have no depth in the skill positions than the more physically impactful positions like linebacker, D-line, running back, and offensive line especially. So, yeah, I think those recruiting classes are going to be a problem for USC. And I don't think you can just fix them with one offseason of transfers. Now, will USC be better this year? Way better.
Yeah, no doubt. They're not going to be 4-8 again.
No. I think, to me, like 8-4 is kind of their floor. It's just they're not going to be this elite team, in my opinion, that everybody thinks they are, unless I just don't see it. I just don't see it. I mean, Oklahoma last year wasn't that kind of team, and they were a far more stable program with a lot of the same players we're talking about, counting on this year that were part of that team. I don't see it.
From Salty Virginia Peanuts, question: what changed with the Great One to bring his commitment forward? I don't think he visited UT after canceling his official visit a few weeks ago, but did I miss something?
No, I've been trying to drop hints about this for a couple weeks, right? And I just felt all along from everything I was hearing that he was going to decide. And we were told about 5 days ago that he was going to commit to 15th, which is why I was hinting in yesterday's show, don't be surprised if, he changes things. But I didn't want to just come out and say it because that's not my moment. It's his moment. And so I don't think it was anything necessarily changed as much as it's just over time. He just kind of kept waking up in the morning and being like, this is the move. And that's what I said it would be, right? He's just going to keep waking up every morning and be like, it's Notre Dame. It's Notre Dame. Because Notre Dame was clearly his favorite school. It just, he was being thoughtful and being methodical like a lot of Notre Dame kids are. And I want to see how the offenses play out. But he kept waking up every morning and being like, this is the move. And, he's gotten to know Braylon James really well. And I think he just realized, like, okay, I got to show a little bit of faith here, right? And trust that they're going to get this thing rolling. And they got CJ Carr now and all. Because you got to remember, Jaden Greathouse understands the value of a great quarterback because he was playing with Cade Klubnik the last few years. You know what I mean? So, so he understands the importance of having a great quarterback. And I think having CJ Carr, I don't know if this is directly true. This is me just kind of reading just reading the situation. I think it's one of those things where I think that is one. Don't be shocked if the presence of CJ Carr helped that a little bit. Again, that's just 100% Brian Driscoll's opinion, but we'll have to see right now.
Yeah. Paul Rose, Brian, I know and I'm paying up, but do you think our D-line and O-line can and will dominate the trenches versus Ohio?
That's a little inside joke. Do you think our D-line and O-line can and will? Can they? Yes, they can dominate the trenches. Will they? That's a different challenge, especially on the other side of the ball. I have faith that Notre Dame's offensive line can dominate Ohio State. I think that the defensive line can dominate Ohio State, but I think Ohio State's got a good offensive line. I think Ohio State's offensive line is a little bit overrated by some, but it's still good. Paris Johnson's a talented kid. DeJuan Jones is solid. Luke Whipple's a really nice center. I think Matthew Jones is going to start at guard. He's a veteran guy. I mean, they'll have a good offensive line, but I think Notre Dame just has better players. And so I think they can dominate in the trenches. Do I think they will? That's not going to be an easy task. This isn't USC, right? This isn't a team that lacks talent. I think Notre Dame has better talent. If in order to dominate USC, Notre Dame just has to play their game in the trenches. They just have to play their game.
Right.
In order to dominate Ohio State in the trenches, they have to play their best game.
Best game, I agree.
And that's the difference. So they just have to play well enough to somewhat negate the skill advantage. Right. That's really what it boils down to for me.
Michael S., thank you so much for the super chat, Michael. He says, who are the top 3 O-line coaches? Who are the top 3 O-linemen? And who have the top 322 O-line recruits? He's digging deep on this one. Holy smokes.
Who are the top 3 offensive line coaches? I would say, my opinion, Harry Hiestand, Kyle Flood, and Bill Bedenbaugh from Oklahoma. I think those are the three best in my opinion. I think though, just of one I know, there's other good coaches out there, but I think those are the 3 for me that have the proven track record. They've all won Joe Moore awards, I think, but also just long term, just producing great lines year after year, showing the ability to lose players and still have a great line, to recruit at a high level. I think they've all proven that. They're all technicians. Their teams play physical football to a degree. Bedenbaugh's offensive lines aren't as physical as Kyle Flood's and Harry Hiestand's, but that's more of a Lincoln Riley thing than it is him. I think he would like that, but just the nature of the scheme doesn't allow you to. I mean, it's a lot of G scheme and a lot of wraps and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily geared towards being just blow him off the line.
Technical.
But what his offensive coach wants him to do, they did it at an elite level on the offensive line. And like, there was one year they lost like 4 starters. It was like Orlando Brown. I mean, they lost like 4 stars of their offensive line, and they came back the next year, and they weren't quite as good, but they were still really good on the offensive line. And that's the mark of a great coach, is you can lose all that talent and still put a pretty good product on the field. And that's why I said, if Jeff Quinn is the coach that some Notre Dame fans of Brian Kelly said he is, losing starters shouldn't have meant you sucked. Maybe you weren't as good as you were in 2020, but you shouldn't have sucked. And they sucked last year. So I think those are my 3 top offensive line coaches. Who are the top 3 offensive lines? Michael, I couldn't give you an answer on that one with any kind of confidence, because there's a lot of teams I still have to watch.
Sure.
I think Notre Dame's going to have a really good offensive line. I think by the end of the year, Ohio State could have a pretty good offensive line. I think Oklahoma, Bedenbaugh stayed at Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma's offense, their new offensive coordinator, Jeff Lebby, came from Lane Kiffin's system. They like to run the football. I think Oklahoma's going to have a really good offensive line this year. BYU should have a pretty darn good offensive line this year. So there's some good units. Michigan brings a lot back from last year. They should have a pretty decent offensive line. But, Michael, honestly, there's a lot of teams I still have to study that I'm just not familiar with. So I'll tell you some teams I like, but I'm not going to rank them yet because I just have to break them down more. We'll do something like that as we get closer to the season, and I've been able to pop in some film and look at who's coming back for everybody and have a better sense of that. But those are some teams that I think are going to be some of the better lines. Like I know Georgia lost some guys, but I'm not quite sure how many they have coming back, and I know their O-line coach retired. So, I mean, I'd have to study them more. They had a pretty good offensive line last year. But those are some of the different ones I like. So here's a 2-parter for this next one, Vince.
Okay, so Chris Hearn, Brian and Vince, I noticed something very small in the bowl game, but to me, it stood out like a sore thumb. Anytime an Irish player was tackled on the sideline near Marcus Freeman, he immediately helped them up. That was something you never saw from BK. Love what Marcus Freeman brings to this program, and I'm very confident in where this program is headed. Go Irish.
All right, I'm going to stick up for Brian Kelly a little bit on this one.
Whoa, I'm out.
Brian Kelly's a little dude, and I don't mean that disrespect. Brian Kelly's like 5'8", 5'7".
He's not a big
He's
dude.
a little guy. I don't think – I mean, and again, I think it's also, when Marcus Freeman was he was still sort of in D coordinator mode last year in the bowl game. In a lot of ways, it takes time. I don't want to put that on Kelly. I don't think that's indicative. I mean, look, I think what I think of Brian Kelly, Chris, right? I mean, everybody knows what I think of Brian Kelly. That I'm not gonna bang him for that one. I mean, like, he's a little fella. Like, I don't want him walking up to Marcus Freeman. Still looks like he could be playing linebacker. You know what I mean? At Ohio State. I mean, he's a in shape, built, strong dude. Brian Kelly's almost 60 years old and 5'7", 5'8". And I'm not saying those things to insult him. Lou Holtz is small.
Yeah, right.
Right? It's just a reality. I don't know how effective he would be trying to help up, Isaiah Foskey off of the ground. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm just not going to go there.
Though. But yeah,
I'm not going to. But I hope. I mean, if you're right, that'd be great. But to the second point, I love what he brings to the program too. The bigger thing is every time I talk to a source, someone related to the players or other people around the program, I mean, there's a lot of excitement because they believe that they have a coach that has their back.
Yeah.
And now that doesn't mean they're not going to get pushed
Right. Sure.
They are going to get pushed, and great players want to be pushed. That's part of giving a rip is I want you to ride me. I want you to get on me, but also want you to know that you're doing it because you want the best for me on and off the field. And I think Marcus Freeman brings that. The kids believe that about him. And the more and more he does it, the more and more kids, the more and more kids will believe in him.
Michael S., thanks for the super chat. Why did Notre Dame have so much trouble with mobile quarterbacks last year? Was it Freeman's scheme? What do they need to do to change that? Michael, I don't know if this is the first time you've watched Notre Dame football, but
it went a lot longer than last year.
I mean that with all due respect, Michael. But Notre Dame's defenses have struggled with mobile quarterbacks for years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, go back and watch the Louisville game at the beginning of the 2019 season for a refresher. I think specifically last year, though, I think that last year's team was not a good tackling team. The last 2 years, I didn't feel like Notre Dame was a good tackling team, especially. I mean, there's been years in the past. 2019, they weren't great. But I really felt like the last couple years especially, they were not a good tackling team. And I think that when that happens, you're going to get exposed the most at quarter if you have an athletic quarterback. And I think part of it too is there were some gap discipline issues last year that we discussed. And at times, like a guy would kind of go here and it's like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. Yeah. And guy runs through for a big play. We saw that against Sam Howell. And so I think that's part. And the other part of it too, honestly, in like the North Carolina game, I think they were kind of willing to let Sam Howell run it. Because if he was running it, it means he wasn't throwing it.
Yeah.
And it means Josh Downs didn't have the football.
Yeah.
you know
Seriously,
what I mean?
Yeah. Because when you're I think it bears some explanation here. Sometimes when you're playing an offense, you can't stop everything. And so you have to pick and choose, all right, what's going to hurt us the most? We need to put the most attention there. And you're going to say, okay, well, you know what, Sam, go ahead and beat us with your legs. You know what I mean? And they didn't. And that ended up being a good decision. So there is a bit of that, but I will also say that I have not been happy overall with Notre Dame's defense against mobile quarterbacks. They do scare me, and until they prove me wrong or prove differently, I'm going to be worried when Notre Dame plays a mobile quarterback.
Here's the thing: their top two opponents this year, neither one of them are overly mobile quarterbacks.
And there you go. Yeah,
now,
that's a good point.
They tried to make DJ Uiagalelei.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
that was close.
You're there.
That was close. They tried to make him a runner last year, and he's just not. No, he's not.
He's a big dude, and he doesn't go down easily.
And
but
he can run, he can move, but he's not overly mobile. CJ Stroud also isn't a much of a runner either. If you look at his numbers last year, he ended up with a whopping minus 20 yards on 32 carries last year for Ohio State. I mean, so he can tuck it and move the chains, but he's not a guy that you're going to look at and be like, oh wow, you're worried about that guy taking off and running. He's a decent athlete, but he's not.
But they're not going to be doing. They're not going to be doing zone reads with him. They're not going to be getting him outside the pocket, and giving him the option to run.
That could be a potentially bigger issue against North Carolina is probably going to have a really mobile quarterback this year, depending on who starts. Syracuse is going to have a really mobile quarterback this year. Boston College is going to have a pretty mobile quarterback this year. Stanford's quarterback's a statue. BYU's quarterback's a pretty mobile kid. DJ is not, to me, someone that I'm overly concerned about. I mean, as far as avoiding pressure and things like that. So that's the nice thing, too, is you get into the postseason. Georgia's not going to have necessarily Stetson Bennett's a decent athlete. He doesn't scare me as a runner. Bryce Young's not much of a runner. The nice thing is I think the only team with a really dynamic run-throw type of quarterback is USC. They have a guy that can run, who's dangerous with his legs, and Caleb Williams. That's it. That's really the only one. But yeah, I think the nature of that offense makes it a little easier to defend his legs because you're not going to be as concerned about the run, in my opinion, because of that. So, all right. Got a couple more before we get out of here.
Derek Jancart. I don't know, Brian. I watched a lot of Ohio State last year. Both lines looked butter soft.
So that comment was about could Notre Dame dominate in the trenches. Derek, I don't disagree with you. And that's one of the things we've said about Ohio State.
That's what gives us,
Right, because if you look at the two games they lost last year, they got dominated in the trenches, especially their defense. They scored 27 and 28 points in those two games. And to me, I think when I look at this year's offensive line makeup, I think it's going to be a little bit more athletic. I think Paris Johnson at left tackle over Nicholas Pettit-Frere is going to be a more mobile guy. He's going to be more athletic. You're going to be it's very experienced. DeJuan James is huge. Matthew Jones is a big kid. Get Luke Whippler back. I mean, it's just, and the other thing too is they're going to be coached by a more physically oriented guy. They're getting a Steve Adazio disciple. Now, will that matter in the opener? I don't know.
Good question.
We'll see. But then you could say the same thing about Notre Dame, who's going to have new line coaches in the opener. All I'm saying is they can, but it's not like USC where they just don't have talent.
Right.
That's the difference. I do think Ohio State's a little bit soft. What we're going to find out this year is if that was just sort of an anomaly type of thing, or if that's just a trend of who this coach is. Because I would argue the same thing in 2020. They weren't an overly physical team. 2019, a little closer. But was that more because they were physical in nature or because they just had a freak like Chase Young who just was really dominant?
Right.
So I do think that's a legitimate question, but I think that is partly why Ryan Day made some of the coaching changes he made, was to bring out more of that from his football team. I mean, you don't go hire Justin Fry if you want to be a passive football team, in my opinion. Now, the difference is can you then implement that if – you can want that, but can you implement that on how you go about your business every day? Vince, you and I both know you may want to be physical, but being physical isn't just as hire a good O-line coach. You got to structure your entire personality around that being brought out on a daily basis. And to me, that's a legitimate question.
It's how you coach them. It's it's the drills that you run. It's the emphasis. It's what you emphasize, right? And that's the biggest thing.
And so that's my point. They have to play really well. Michigan played really well against Ohio State last year. They didn't just roll out and just out physical them because they showed up. They played at a high level on both sides of the ball and dominated them in the trenches. And that's different than just being better than the guy you're going against. That's the difference for me. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. I still think that doesn't change the notion that Notre Dame still has to kind of go out and play well to dominate. They're not just going to. It's not going to be like USC in 2017, where they're just a soft team and they just didn't have a lot of talent. And they just quit.
That was fun.
Ohio State's not going to quit like USC did in 2017. I can promise you that.
Chris Basker, thanks for the super chat. Could Notre Dame flip Vizina from Clemson if they wanted to?
I don't think so. No. I think a lot of this comes from the notion there was a report out there supposedly.
Yeah, I remember this.
That people thought that he was going to pick Notre Dame if he visited and all this kind of stuff. And I never bought it at the time. I thought he liked Notre Dame, but I always thought Clemson was the team to beat. His dad and Dabo Swinney have known each other since they were in college, I believe.
Oh, okay.
And so there's a family connection there that I just think would be hard to do. Plus, Notre Dame passed on him. I mean, he's going to know that. And one thing he said before he committed to Clemson was, Clemson's the one school that always treated me like I was their number one guy. Bama, he wasn't. No, they wanted Arch. I'm trying to think of some of the other schools he looked at that wanted Arch. And then, Notre Dame wanted Dante and all that. So I just.
That means something.
I think it'd be tough.
That means something.
Yeah. Last couple here. I think we're getting close to the end.
Jack Layson says, did you guys see that Joel Klatt and Colin Cowherd yesterday? Klatt said the only school the Big Ten will take right now is Notre Dame. Every other school out there takes away more than they add.
Well, I don't agree with the last part. I think there's a reason that Ohio State really wants to get the Big Ten really wants to get one of the Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, because there are some markets down there that they'd like to get into. But, I think the Big Ten, if they're smart, are going to be patient with this. There's no need to rush this decision. You're not getting USC for a couple years. There's no need to, Notre Dame, you have a week, and if you don't decide, we're going to go bring in Oregon and Washington. That's the thing is I agree with them to some degree. I don't agree with them overall. I think that too many people, and we were on a show last night with Max Torres at Ducks Digest, and he kind of made this point. And the thing I push back on him is you got to stop looking at how good the football programs are, because that's not what's driving these decisions. It's all about TV markets.
Yes, exactly.
And getting into certain regions of the country you want to be a part of. And to me, they want to get into that Mid-Atlantic. The Big Ten wants to get in that Mid-Atlantic. They have a Southern team now, right? Or they have Southwestern teams now, right? You've got Texas and Oklahoma. You've got the West Coast now. Where they are not is they're not in the Southeast. And I think they would like to get in there as best they can. So, that's where you could see a North Carolina maybe they try to steal Miami or something like that. Who knows? But I think those are some of the different aspects that I look at and say that's what you have to be thinking. Stop looking at how they are as football programs and start looking at how big of a TV market are they and what kind of fan base do they have that teams are going to want to be a part of. Like, that's one of the reasons a lot of the Pac-12 teams are just not attractive. Say, yeah, they're in a big TV market, right? But are they college football fans? That's the difference. Like,
right.
A lot of the Pac-12 teams are in big cities. San Francisco is basically the home of Stanford and Cal, basically. Seattle is where Washington plays. Portland's not that far from Oregon. It's a decent-sized market. The two Arizona schools are near Phoenix, which is, I think I read, is like the 11th biggest TV market in the country right now.
And growing.
Right. Denver is a big market, but they just don't give a crap about college football.
Right.
Look, I lived in Denver. They do not care about Colorado or Colorado State. They don't. They care about one football team, and that's it. It's the Broncos.
Right.
So I don't care how big the market is. It's not a college football market. And that's what you have to look at. And then also, what are the fan bases like? Are you going to be selling out your stadium? Like, one of the attractive aspects of, and I read this today in The Athletic, was a really good point that was made in the article, is part of the reason the Pac-12 wants Big 12 teams is because the Big 12 teams travel well.
Yeah.
Where the Pac-12 teams really don't. Because unless you're from the West Coast, and I'm saying this because my wife is, and I know people from there, unless you're from there or know people there, I don't think you realize how apathetic they are towards sports in general, but especially college sports. And it's been that way for a long time, and unless they're good, like really good, that's like, if USC is great the next 3 years, you'll think they have the most loyal fan base in America.
Of course, because they're bandwagon.
First year they go 7-5, they stop giving a crap.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just
absolutely correct.
So, and Stanford fans don't care no matter how good their team is. And that's the sad part, because they had some really, really good teams. I want to respond to this from Brandon Plensner. He says, yeah, my point is Vizina was not Clemson's top target. He's talking about they wanted Arch. The thing you have to understand, Brandon, is you're looking this from a logical standpoint. That's not how you spin it. Clemson was never a player for Arch. They never kind of got into where they were recruiting only Arch and he was their number one target and all. They never got there with him. Of course they wanted Arch. There's other quarterbacks they had. But when they started recruiting Chris Vizina, they treated him like number one because they knew they weren't going to be much of a player with Arch.
Sure.
And so they were able to tell him that, whether they wanted Arch or not. Now, if Arch would have been interested, then, maybe it's a different story. But in the world of Chris Vizina, the story is they never were that way. That's what you got to understand, because he doesn't follow recruiting like you do. All right. That's the thing that you have to understand, is to him, they were there. So that's just kind of how you have to see it. And no, if you ever ask, hey, did you guys see Joel Klatt and Colin Cowherd? 9 out of 10 times my answer is going to be no. So just tell me what they said. And
then we'll respond to it. Yeah, exactly.
I like Joel Klatt. I just can't stand Colin Cowherd.
That makes two of us.
Yeah.
Corey D, thanks for the super chat. Appreciate it. Who are the 3 biggest brands in college football? Not greatest programs, but biggest brands. Okay. Notre Dame, Texas, and then I think you're in the running for like Michigan, Ohio State,
I think
Alabama.
Ohio State is clearly third as far as a brand. Because brand is more of your reach.
No, I get it.
I think Ohio State probably be in there.
Okay.
Michigan's Michigan's brand is more all encompassing as opposed to just college football.
Okay, so we're talking about football brand,
right? That's why Michigan's not in there for me.
Okay.
Whereas what's Ohio State known for?
Football,
college football.
Yeah, no doubt.
With Michigan, it's it's basketball, it's all these other things, right? And they still try to live in this world of being an academic institution and all that kind of stuff. I think and again, I don't know if Bama's a brand, because here's the thing: if Bama stops being good at football, do they still carry a lot of power? They are a football powerhouse. I don't think they're a huge brand. You know what I mean? And there's a difference. Brand is, are you going to find fans of that team everywhere? Is there financial, places there? And that's just not true at Bama. Like USC's not a brand. I mean,
USC is not a brand outside of California.
No. Outside of just their football tradition, but it's not a huge brand. And so again, branding is about financial power. That's what brand means, in my opinion.
Sure.
And to me, I don't think it's overly. I think Michigan could maybe at least be in a conversation. But honestly, for me, off the top of my head, I can't think of 3 bigger brands than the ones we mentioned: Notre Dame, Texas, and Ohio State.
And here would be my test. I would just take logos of the schools and show them to people who don't follow college football at all.
Like, or show them the helmet.
Whatever. Yeah. Like something that would represent that school. Like for my wife, for example, just she would have no idea who a lot of these hold it up, tell me who they are. And if she can tell me who they are, they got a big brand. You know what I mean? Like, and that's just an example, but that's branding to me. It's people who don't follow the sport that know who they are for that reason.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's where I would go.
Yeah. And it's all financial. I mean, that's the thing you have to understand is it's all financial. And then, like the thing about Notre Dame could go play a game anywhere in the world. And people know who
they played in Japan, Brian. Yeah, so yeah,
I mean, right. And people have to understand that, right?
Yeah,
and,
right.
You know,
they play in Ireland. They're playing in,
you know, and Ohio State's brand comes. I mean, Ohio State's got a bit of it, but Ohio State's brand is because Ohio is just such a huge school, and
very large.
You know, it's just it's a unique thing,
right?
It's a very unique thing. So you know, we'll have to kind of see how that.
That's a great question, Corey. Yeah. We could do a whole show.
I would say I would probably put Texas over Ohio State for number 2.
I would too. Oh, yeah. I would too. Yes. ND Texas was my 1-2.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, those are my 1-2, no question.
Yeah. So I just, and again, if Bama goes through a 3-year stretch where they're not good, they lose. They're not relevant. Texas and Notre Dame haven't been good for a long time. And they're still like, why did the SEC pursue Texas? They haven't been relevant in football since like 2009.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? It's because it's not about that. It's about the brand. And because they do have that Austin, Dallas area, it's a huge financial market, you know, and it's known everywhere.
There's a reason
oil money and all these other kind of
There's a reason they have the Longhorn Network, right? I mean, it just is. You know, whether it was a successful thing or not, there's still a reason for it.
Yeah. Yep. Here we go. We had a few more pop up while we were doing this. Here we go. Here's another one from Derek.
Derek, thank you very much for the super chat. I agree with your counter argument to the Ohio State lines. They have talent. It seems the physicality of Ohio State has waned since Urban Meyer left.
I think that's very accurate. Again, I'm not arguing that Ohio State's a physical football team. All I'm saying is I think Ryan Day would like them to be more physical. That's why he fired his offensive line coach and brought in Justin Fry. My question is he going to create an institute a philosophy on a day-to-day basis that makes them physical? I don't know.
Right.
But you know, I don't disagree with you. And I felt that way about Oklahoma. I've made this argument about Oklahoma. The further they got along away from Bob Stoops, the less physical they were and the less effective they were really running the football in big games.
Sure.
That's just reality.
Yeah, right.
And because Bob Stoops instilled that and Lincoln Riley lived off of it a little bit, we're going to find out this year if Ryan Day is that or not. Because I still think there's some questions about Ryan Day. As you get further away from Urban, can you be better than what you were under Urban? That's going to be a legitimate question. You know, because he's still kind of living in that area where, and I'm not saying this is right or fair. It's just a reality where there's going to be questions of, okay, you still have kids on your team that were kind of urban guys, you know, urban recruits, you know, or were influenced by urban recruits and the urban mentality and coaches and stuff like that. I don't know if that's necessarily fair because I think Urban was more of a problem than he was a positive his last couple of years, just for all the off the field crap and everything else. But I think that's the knock. So if he can get that back on top, then I think it's going to show that, you know, that you've kind of taken that next step.
Right.
So, all right, here we go.
Michael with another super chat. Thank you very much. Who are the top O-line recruit classes this year so far?
I mean, honestly, I don't know if there's really, if I'm in a situation right now where I could even really tell you, because there's just aren't a lot of teams that have filled up line classes. I mean, obviously Notre Dame right now is the best line class in the country.
They've got 5 guys. I mean,
Ohio State has 3 4-star kids. That's a decent line class. I don't love it, but it's going to be ranked high. Penn State has a couple highly ranked guys. They have 2 top 10 guys, Alex Birchmeier and Javon Williams, and I really like Alex Birchmeier a lot. I think he's a really talented player. Outside of that, I don't really know if there are a lot of teams with great offensive line classes, to be honest with you, because it's just so early. And a lot of teams are still trying to fill up their line classes. Notre Dame tends to be, they're kind of full. I mean, right now they're filled up.
Full.
Other teams are going to,
they got their 5.
Keep adding to it. So I'd say probably, in my opinion, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Penn State are probably the 3 line classes I like the best of the ones I'm aware of. Somebody in the chat could maybe point one out that they like better, but I mean, I don't know I think Alabama may has like 1 O-lineman maybe right now. So I think those are the 3 that I would say are solid. And I think Ohio State's is more, it's in there because of the rankings. I don't think a lot of their guys, I don't think Luke Montgomery is a top 100 player. I just don't. He's a good player. He's not a top 100 guy. I don't think Austin Saraveld's a, top 200 guy. He's a good player. Josh Padilla is a little overrated for me, but they're still all good football players. It's just, to me, I'm not taking their top 3 over Notre Dame's top 3. Well, they're 3 over Notre Dame's top 3 at this point in time. And that's kind of where I'm at for this one. Last couple before we get out of here.
All right, Sarah McCoy, does the Big 12 Pac-12 merger matter? Well, they haven't announced that they're doing.
Well, there's the stuff today is that the Big 12 is looking to be aggressive in adding the 2 Arizona schools.
Oh, I see.
Colorado, Utah, Oregon, and Washington.
It matters to them because they're trying to stay relevant.
I think it would actually matter a lot.
Yeah.
I think that would, if the Big 12 can do that, I think, like, if I'm the Big 12 commissioner, here's what I'm doing. Because the ACC and the Pac-12 are trying to start some kind of like alliance, which, how well that work out when you have the Big 10 in it, where they're talking about, like, playing a championship game against each other and all this other stuff. If I'm the Big 12 commission, this is what I'm doing. I'm rating the Pac-12, because what you're doing is you are adding the Phoenix market, which, again, is a big market. Hopefully you can turn it into a college town. I think I think there is a Texas influence in Arizona. So if you're playing some of those Texas schools, I think that might be more attractive to people in Arizona than playing Cal or Stanford or whatever. Colorado is going to be an interesting one, because there's going to be a lot of old rivalries there that still exist there when they were in the Big 8 and Big 12 in the past. But you're also adding a big Denver market. Now, as I said before, it's not as impactful, but it doesn't hurt. Utah, now you've solidified that Salt Lake City market, because you've got BYU and Utah. So and when that game, I mean, you're going to get some, there's a Mormon influence, especially in the Polynesian areas on the West Coast.
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Where you see BYU and Utah have a lot of success recruiting. You're going to see that also be a positive. And then, of course, you're adding Seattle to your league. And then you're adding Oregon, who's a football brand. Even though they're not necessarily a big market, you're adding a football brand.
Sure.
So I think the other thing that would do, too, beyond the TV aspect of it, is adding Oregon and adding Washington and Utah would give the Big 12 what it doesn't have right now once Texas and Oklahoma leaves, and that is legitimate football programs that can go out there and compete with the big boys.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, Oregon's twice played for the national title in the last 12 years, right? Twice. Utah has beaten Bama in a Sugar Bowl in the last 15 years. They've had several top 10 finishes. They're a legit football team. Washington has a national championship history. Now, they haven't been good recently, but there aren't a lot of teams in the Big 12 after them that could talk about having national championships in their history, right? And then Colorado has some tradition too. So, but their football team stinks. But I think you'd have some markets that you'd add to the Big 12. And I think the other part of it is you'd take some really good football programs to a conference that right now doesn't have it. I mean, because what are you building your brand around right now? TCU, Baylor, Oklahoma State.
Well, and then they brought in a bunch
BYU,
of lower
Cincinnati.
tier teams. I mean, I've been, to be honest, I mean, nothing against Cincinnati, but
lower tier brands.
Yeah, brands. Thank you. That's a really good way to put it. And I think if they do this, they're setting themselves up not to be dismissed.
Right, because you have some legit football teams. I mean, you're adding what has arguably been the best arguably, if you take the entire – now, they've had some ups and down years, but so has USC and so has Stanford. But from 2010 to 2021, I would argue that the best football team, like the best football program overall, since 2010 in the Pac-12, has been Oregon.
Sure.
Right? And so you're taking them. Washington was a playoff team 5 years ago, right? Utah has had several top 10 finishes in recent years. So you're adding football credibility, Vince, to your point, to a conference that might have some markets but doesn't have football credibility.
Right.
I think, and then name me another conference in right now that if they did that could say we have 3 playoff teams in our league. Right? The SEC, I think, is the only one that can do that, right?
Sure.
Because the Big Ten has only had Ohio State and Michigan, right? None of the other Big Ten teams have made. Oh, Michigan State. Okay, so they would have 3. The SEC has had more than 3, I think, right? No, have they only had 3? Alabama, Georgia, LSU. That's it. A&M hasn't made it. Florida hasn't made it. Tennessee hasn't made it. Yeah, so 3. So they have the same number of playoff teams as everybody else.
They would position themselves better than the ACC
and the Pac-12. Well, see, that's the second thing that
the Pac-12 I think would go away at that point. I mean,
well, what I'm saying is you look at the reputation right now. People are like, wait, the Pac-12 should absorb the Big 12. No. The Big 12 should absorb the Pac-12.
No, that I agree with 100%.
Right.
The Big 12 needs to absorb the top teams out of the Pac-12.
Yes, because the Pac-12 just nobody cares about the Pac-12. Pac-12 fans don't really care about the Pac-12.
Right.
And then what I'm doing if I'm him is say, hey, you know that deal that you were talking about having with the Pac-12? We're game.
Yes.
Absolutely. We'll work with you to try to help you survive. So you can come down here and play some things with us. And to me, I think that is what I would do if I was the Big 12 commissioner, is I would work hard to get those teams into your league. Plus, I think that the Big 12 right now has a better TV deal than the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 has lost all negotiating power to get a bigger deal now that they lost the the LA market. Because see, now you take your Phoenix market, you take your Denver market, your Salt Lake City market, and your Seattle market, and you move them into a conference that has Texas, that has Houston, has Dallas, has Cincinnati, you've got a flavor in Florida now, although I don't think it's going to be super impactful. But I would say that's going to be a lot better than trying to absorb those, because people in Texas are going to like playing Oregon. Mm-hmm. Right? They're going to like playing Washington, Utah. There's the Colorado. People in Washington are not going to give 2 rips about Oklahoma State coming out there to play a game against a bunch of Pac-12 teams.
Right.
So meaning, like, if you take 4 or 5 Big 12 teams and put them in the Pac-12, that doesn't do a whole lot for them. I think Utah has a more of a Big 12 feel to it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Like,
I do. And there's a rivalry that Utah has with several Pac-12 or Big 12 teams because they used to be in the Mountain West together. Remember, Utah and TCU have played some mammoth games in the last decade when they were in the Mountain West together. And obviously Utah and BYU play the Holy War. I mean, you'd have a built-in rivalry called the frickin' Holy War, man.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? And so you'd have Colorado would have some rivalries there because they used to be in a conference with these teams. It would make way more sense to do that than for the Big 12 teams to leave for the Pac-12.
Agreed.
I think the Pac-12 commissioner is kidding himself if he thinks without LA market that they're at all attractive to anyone else.
I agree.
And so if I'm the Big 12 commissioner, I'm going to do whatever I can to get that done. And then I'm calling up the ACC and saying, no, you need to get on board with us. Forget them. You need to get on board with us.
Yeah.
And we'll partner together. And then all of a sudden, maybe Notre Dame might say, you know what? I think we might start scheduling some of these teams.
Sure.
And then maybe Notre Dame's, carry some way. Hey, look, Pac-12, we'll work with the ACC to merger with you, partner with you, if you make me a promise. Go out and bring in Stanford. Bring in Stanford and, somebody else. Because there's a vested interest in Notre Dame, I think, to me, protecting Stanford a little bit so that the academic school doesn't fall by the wayside, because nobody wants Stanford. There's no monetary value in having Stanford.
Nobody wants.
They're going to end up playing in the WAC. I mean, meaning like their football team's going to be in the Mountain West, and maybe their other sports playing the WAC or something like that. I mean, because why would you want a football program where literally nobody gives a crap about your football team?
Yeah.
So that's the team of all the Power 5 teams. Stanford and Cal, to me, are in the most danger of being left out. Because who wants them?
Oh, I completely agree.
If the Pac-12, and this is why for them it's important that the Pac-12 stays alive, because if the Pac-12 dissolves, who's going to want Stanford and Cal?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. The Ivy League? Sorry, I had to.
John Lacey says, rate your excitement for Tyler Buckner compared to your excitement for Wimbush coming into their first years as starters.
Oh, very similar.
Yeah,
very similar. Except I think Tyler's a better thrower.
Yeah,
Tyler's a better thrower.
I was really high on Wimbush when
Mhm.
before he started playing at Notre Dame. I remember telling a buddy that I thought he was going to be the best Notre Dame quarterback in a really long time. I was really high on Brandon Wimbush, and then he got screwed up. To almost no fault of his own, but whatever, that gets a little deeper. But going into the season, I want to say I was probably higher on Wimbush than I was on Tyler Buckner. But looking back on the way Wimbush ended up, I think Tyler Buckner's going to have a better career. But that's the luxury of hindsight. You know what I mean? I thought Wimbush was the full package, man, going in. I was super pumped about him. Not to take away any excitement that I have for Tyler Buckner, but for whatever reason, I was super high on Wimbush.
I loved Brandon Wimbush coming out. I had Tyler Buckner rated higher. I love the 3 highest rated quarterbacks I've had since I've started following Notre Dame. 4 highest rated. It's Jimmy Clausen, Everett Golson, Phil Dracovic, and Tyler Buckner. Even ahead of Brandon, and I loved Brandon. I think 2 is Brandon. We had some questions about him as a passer because he had kind of gone through some funky overhauls. I have a lot more confidence about Tyler Buckner being a more effective passer than I have about Brandon Wimbush. And you talk about concern at receiver depth. Notre Dame went into the Georgia game in 2017 trying to beat them with freaking Freddie Canteen, Chris Fink, and Cam Smith.
Yes, they did.
And still almost beat them.
Yes, they did.
So
away from doing it.
Yeah. So I'd say, similar excitement, John. I mean, you're going to add a dynamic runner.
Yes.
You're going to add a guy that can be
a dynamic quarterback. Yeah.
When stuff breaks down, he can take off and do something special. I mean, I think of the Michigan game and Michigan game in 2018, Vince, which was kind of the last great game for Brandon. Remember that 3rd and 18 where he almost got sacked, but he kind of broke a tackle and spun out and then runs for 20. I love Jack Cohn. He's not doing that. Ian Book was a really good scrambler. He's not doing that.
Agreed.
Tyler can do that. Brandon could do that. And you just can't coach that. You can't scheme that. Like, hey, on this play, Brandon or Tyler, I want you to drop back, get hit in the back, bounce off the tackle, and then run for 20. The defense won't expect it at all.
Yeah, right.
Right? I mean, you don't coach that. It's just that's a great player. And a great playmaker. Not a great player, a great playmaker. And I think Tyler brings a lot of that to the table. I just think Tyler's a better passer.
Yeah,
and
I
to
agree.
be honest, I think Tyler's supporting cast at the skill positions is going to be a lot better than what Brandon's was in 2017. With all due respect to Josh Adams, this is a better overall skills. To me, group of players. Yes,
no doubt.
And then last Tyler Buckner question, and we're going to end it with this one. First of all, I just want to say to Sarah McCoy, who is throwing straight fire in the chat at Michigan, which I love. I mean, she is just throwing bombs at Michigan right now. So appreciate you, Sarah, very much.
Just to jump on that argument real quick, that the argument is who's the bigger brand, Michigan or Texas?
Yeah, who's trying to argue? Is a Michigan fan trying to argue that?
Corey D is arguing it. I'm sorry, it's not close. From a branding standpoint, it's Michigan by a lot.
Are we talking hockey?
I don't.
I go with Michigan in hockey. No, it's not even close, man.
No, it's not close at all. But
it's not even close. So that's where her fire came from. Yeah. I mean, she was throwing grenades.
Yes.
It was. I don't know where it came from because I'm working from the bottom up, and it was pretty bad. There was a question here about what we were just talking about. Brandon Plender was Reese Wimbush's QB coach. He got him towards the end. The guy that jacked up Brandon's motion to the point where it was just unfixable. Don't make it worse was Mike Sanford. He coached him for 2 years. And so, yes, Reese was his quarterback's coach as a junior and senior. By that point in time, Brandon's throwing motion was just so god-awful that it was it wasn't fixable.
Right.
There's no question. All right, so this is the last question here. This is also about Tyler. I thought this was interesting.
Yeah, I think this is really Zach Z0221 says, would the dialogue surrounding Tyler Buckner be different if he played in the blue gold game? I think it's a resounding yes.
Yes,
to be honest with you, because not only did he not play, but the nature of the reason that he didn't play just led to so much speculation and so much ire and all of this stuff. If he would have played and been 3/4 of the quarterback that I think he can be, we're not having this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with that, Zach, and I think that's a great point.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We got this. We kind of wrapped this up here, and it was Irish Chi-Town. Brian, his more of a sports talk question was Sean, but will Sports Talk have a weekly mailbag or call-in show? Look, we are not going to do a call-in show for like a million reasons. We're just not. We don't have the ability to screen calls the way that we would need to. Right. Maybe I'll say never, but we're a long way away from that.
Right. You almost need like a full-time producer.
Right.
You need all these different things to make that
now
happen.
what I've thought about doing for fun is like, having people record questions to send in that we could bring up, kind of that kind of thing. I've thought about doing that down the road.
That's not bad.
We'd find a way to kind of, how could we do that and those kind of things. So that's something in the thought process. But like, you got to understand, there's legal protections here. We bring somebody in a live call-in show and they just start saying like just ignorant, stupid, racist, or whatever things, and all of a sudden we're responsible for that.
Yeah, that's a huge problem.
And I'm just not going to subject myself. Where somebody says something stupid in the chat, I can ban them, and it's not a problem. It's not on the show.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So it just in 999 out of 1,000 people would be fine. Right. But it would take that one person
to get us
wants to be a
off
moron,
YouTube or whatever.
Right, exactly.
We don't need that.
As far as the mailbag, so we're trying to take a different approach with that show and it just be more of a sports talk show. But look, Sean will respond to questions during the show and he'll take super chats. But we have talked about maybe during the summer, he may have like a mailbag day where it's like, you know what, there's just not a lot of hot topics in the middle of July. Let's have a mailbag. So there may be some stuff like that, but his is meant to be much shorter and just kind of talking and stuff like that. But you can super chats. He'll take super chats and answer those questions during the show. But as of right now, we're if we were to do a mailbag, we would probably, we kind of already do a lot of those, right? We do the Friday one. We do them after every show that we do during the day. What we're trying to avoid is to make that show the same as this one,
right? With
just different hosts,
right?
Which means some slightly different topics. So we want to be able to talk about other different things, and so I'm not ruling it out, but it'll never be like this. It won't be like 3 hours long. I just wanted to be like, it's 45 minutes to an hour and 15. It's kind of the wheelhouse, and you have the different segments, and I'm just trying to let Sean kind of
different,
do what he does,
totally different.
And take a different place to it. Cause Sean told me, somebody's like, when you guys can talk about football, like, well, sports talk, not football talk. Right. Cause look, when are we going to talk football? How about the 3-hour show we did starting at 1:00?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, and we talked about football and realignment last night, and it was a lot of fun.
It won't just be football is the point. And so I want that show to have a different feel. It's like kind of starting a TV network, right? Like you don't have like, it's like the same kind of show every time. You want to kind of mix it up, right? And so that's what we're trying to do. So when we start, if we branch out into different shows, it'll be different. Ideally, the thing that it's going to be great content, right? But as I said, if you want to get some things talked about, just throw a super chat at them. But Sean and I actually were talking yesterday about the potential of during the summer maybe having a mailbag, or what we've also talked about is maybe having in one of your weekly shows the second half be a mailbag on that particular day. We've talked about some different things like that. But again, we want to try to avoid making this a repeat of this show with just my perspective versus his, or Ryan's perspective versus Vince's. We want it to have a really different feel.
Right.
And that's why we've tried to avoid just kind of doing what works here, there.
Right.
Because otherwise I just would have not paid him and we would just do 2 shows.
Just do another show.
Right. I think Sean brings something really different and unique and excellent that I want to be a part of our network. And so we're going to go about that. But that's a great question, Irish Chi-Town, because I know you're not the only one asking that.
Sure.
And I really appreciate you asking that question.
I kind of dig the idea of getting some pre-recorded type questions. Like they record themselves, they email it to us, we can screen it, we can throw it up and then answer it. Like I've thought about something like that. Yeah, I think there's some merit to that.
I got to dive more into that with Sean. I think that could be fun. But again, it's just you got to understand like the call, and it takes it takes a financial investment to invest in the
tech,
all the different, boards and all these different things. And it's just, we're just not there yet. And again, I want it to have a different feel, but I hope you all understand, we're not even close to being done. Like, we're not like, hey, we found our sweet spot, let's live right here. You know what I mean? Like,
there's no living anywhere.
We're going to keep this thing growing.
Yeah, man.
If we got to the point where we started just doing like, hour-long, like 5-hour-long shows, because we had different time. Maybe we get to that point someday.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be opposed to that necessarily. But then, of course, I'd have to pull rank and say, no, my show's going to be longer because I can't condense everything into an hour. I just talk too much. Got to know your strengths and weaknesses, Vince. Right? So you didn't need to laugh that hard.
Real life comedy is what gets me. It's the
That's
observational comedy.
That's
and that's
right.
what gets me.
That's
buddy.
right. Anyway, Vince, that's going to do it, buddy. Why don't you go ahead and take us out of here?
Absolutely. So thanks everybody for paying attention and hanging out with us for a little while. Really appreciate it. Make sure you hit that like button, the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, because you never know when we're going to come on with a second or a third show. Speaking of a second show, there is another one coming at 6 o'clock. It is the IB Nation Sports Talk with Sean, and I am not sure what they are talking about tonight.
He just sent me the topic.
Beautiful.
Could Notre Dame save college football as we know it?
Oh, man.
He's also going to have a USC beat writer on with him tonight.
Oh, nice. Nice.
So very interesting topic tonight.
Very
cool.
I'm
kind of bummed and a little annoyed that I didn't think of that, because that's going to be a great topic.
Well, and let me add on to it. Go check out irishbreakdown.com, because Sean has a great article that he wrote about Marcus Freeman and Bill Polian.
He took the 11 points that Bill Polian writes to what make a successful coach when he talked about hiring coaches. And he went through and kind of talked about where Marcus Freeman falls on all 11 of them really well. And he just sent it to me last night, like random. I had no clue he was writing it. Like, we didn't talk about it. He just like, hey, here's an article. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, thanks. This is really good.
It was really
because he's also going to be our new beat writer as well.
It was really good.
David Knight with a super chat here last second. Bought my ticket for August 6th. When I get home, we'll grab some IB gear. Go Irish. David is obviously overseas for now, so we are happy to hear that you're going to be coming home soon.
That's awesome.
I don't know if that's going to be for good or just a visit, man, but we'd love to obviously get you back safe and sound. So that's awesome. Really, really appreciate that. And Vince, why don't you just let Mace K take us out of here?
I love that.
He gave us 2 super chats.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't think he meant to do that. So if you didn't mean to do that, David, get with me and we can.
Yeah, no kidding.
We can get that corrected. But let's
Mason always takes us out. Really appreciate it. Join the message board, hit the like, subscribe, and the notification bell. Share this podcast and leave a 5-star review. Visit the IB store for the best IB Nation merch. And as always, go Irish.